Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Echoes. This video is meant to help you relax, unwind, or maybe even drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episodes. I hadn't expected to inherit anything from my grandmother. Least of all, a crumbling hotel on the outskirts of a forgotten town in Colorado. It had been years since anyone in our family even mentioned Riverside Lodge. My grandmother was one of those mysterious relatives no one talked much about. She lived her final years in a nursing home, silent and lost in memories we couldn't access. When the lawyer contacted me about the hotel, my first reaction was one of incredulity. What would I, a city dweller who could barely manage an apartment lease, do with an old hotel? I suppose I agreed to visit out of some misplaced sense of obligation, or maybe curiosity. My girlfriend, Lauren, insisted on coming along. "It'll be an adventure," she'd said, her voice carrying the upbeat lilt of someone unaware of the unease. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sky darkening prematurely with thick clouds. Riverside Lodge loomed ahead of us, chipped paint and rotting wood. The sign, barely hanging on by a thread, swung lazily in the breeze. It felt as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for us to step inside. "Charming," Lauren muttered, as she eyed the cracked windows, her sarcasm barely masking her discomfort. I couldn't disagree. The hotel was in an isolated clearing, surrounded by dense trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The air was heavy with dampness, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with pine. It felt wrong to be there, as though we were trespassing on something long forgotten. But there was something else too, something that gnawed at the edges of my awareness, an oppressive stillness that seemed to creep into my chest, making it harder to breathe. Inside, the lobby was a relic of the past. Velvet armchairs with stuffing peeking out, dusty chandeliers hanging precariously, and a grand front desk that had seen better days. It was clear the place had been abandoned for years, left to rot in the middle of nowhere. As I stood there, taking in the decay, I felt an odd mix of dread and sadness. This had been my grandmother's life, at least for a time. Why had she never spoken of it? Lauren, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. "Well, I guess we've got a bit of a fixer-upper on our hands, huh?" I forced a smile, but the unease was growing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, even though we were clearly alone. The first night was quiet, though sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every groan of the old wood seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. I lay in bed, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling the cold seep in through the thin walls. It was strange how a place could feel so suffocating. We spent the next day exploring the hotel, trying to figure out what, if anything, could be salvaged. Most of the rooms were in a similar state: water-damaged walls, broken furniture, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. But there was something else that caught my attention: the guest book. It was an old leather-bound volume, sitting open on the front desk, as though someone had just signed in. The last entry was dated 1978. I ran my finger over the faded ink. A chill ran down my spine as I read the name, Charles Harrington. I didn't recognize it, but something about the neat, precise handwriting seemed off. As I flipped through the book, I noticed something even stranger. The names, the same few names, written over and over again. The names appeared every few pages, as though the same guests had been checking in repeatedly over the course of decades. When I showed Lauren, she shrugged it off. Probably just a quirk of small-town hotels, right? Maybe people in this area had a habit of coming back. She was trying to stay upbeat, but I could tell she was unsettled. I was too. Something about the repetition was deeply wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling the guests had never checked out. That night, it got worse. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming from the hallway just outside our room. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I strained to listen, thinking maybe Lauren had gotten up, but she was fast asleep beside me. I slowly sat up, the floorboards creaking beneath me, and stared at the door. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell again, thick and oppressive. For a moment, I considered waking Lauren, but I didn't want to scare her. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the house settling, or some animal outside. I lay back down, forcing my body to relax, but sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that same creeping sensation that we were not alone in the hotel. The next morning, I brought it up to Lauren, but she dismissed it as nerves. "Old places like this are bound to make noises," she said. "You're just getting in your own head." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the eerie sense of wrongness was just a product of being in an unfamiliar place. But the guestbook nagged at me. I couldn't stop thinking about those names, why they kept reappearing, and why had the entries suddenly stopped in 1978. As the day went on, the unease grew. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way the shadows seemed to linger just a little too long in the corners of rooms. The strange chill in the air that never seemed to dissipate, and the feeling that we were constantly being watched. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. "Something's not right here," I told Lauren. "We need to leave." She looked at me, surprised. "What do you mean? We've only just started." I tried to explain the sense of dread that had been building, the way the hotel seemed to press in on me, but she brushed it off again, calling me paranoid. "It's just an old building," she insisted. "You're letting your imagination run wild." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. That night, everything came to a head. I had fallen into a restless sleep when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My eyes snapped open, and I was immediately aware of the cold, the kind of deep, penetrating cold that clings to your skin. The room was dark, but there was a faint light seeping in from under the door, and then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were louder, closer. Someone was walking up and down the hallway outside our room. My pulse quickened as I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tense with fear. Lauren was still asleep, completely oblivious to the growing terror around us. I swung my legs out of bed, the floor icy beneath my feet. My heart was pounding in my ears as I crept toward the door. I hesitated for a moment, listening. The footsteps had stopped again, but there was something else. A low whispering, too faint to make out, but undeniably there. I held my breath, my hand hovering over the doorknob. And then it happened. The door burst open with a violent crash, and a figure stood in the doorway. A man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and hollow. His eyes were empty, soulless, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the fabric faded and worn, as though he had stepped out of another time. I recognized him immediately. Charles Harrington. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just some name in a guest book. He had never left. He was the hotel, or rather, the hotel was him. An extension of his twisted will. He fed on the fear of those who entered, trapping them in their own minds until they were consumed. I stumbled backward, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Harrington stepped into the room. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. I knew I had to act quickly if I wanted to survive. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy brass lamp, and swung it at him with all my strength. The lamp connected with a sickening thud, but Harrington barely flinched. Instead, he laughed, a low, menacing sound that sent chills down my spine. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. I had to get Lauren, and run. I turned, grabbing her arm, and shaking her awake. "We have to go," I hissed, my voice trembling. I shook Lauren harder, my fingers digging into her arm, as I tried to snap her out of her drowsiness. Her eyes fluttered open, but she still seemed groggy, as if something was keeping her from fully waking up. "What's going on?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. Before I could answer, a sudden pressure filled the room, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. Harrington hadn't moved from the doorway, but it felt like he was everywhere at once, watching us, judging us. The air had grown even colder, and every breath I took felt like it was freezing in my lungs. "We need to go, now," I urged, pulling Lauren up. She was sluggish, still half asleep, and it took all my strength to get her out of bed. My mind was racing, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't leave her behind. Lauren blinked, her eyes finally clearing as she took in the figure standing in the doorway. Her expression changed instantly, fear cutting through the fog of sleep. "Who?" she started, but I cut her off. "There's no time. We have to move." I yanked her toward the door, but Harrington was still blocking the way. His grin widened as if he was enjoying our panic. For a brief moment, the fear ebbed, replaced by a determination to get out, no matter what it took. "Get out of our way," I shouted, my voice sounding braver than I felt. Harrington's grin didn't falter. He raised a hand, and suddenly, the walls of the room began to shift. The entire hotel seemed alive, responding to his will. The door frames stretched, warping grotesquely, and the floor beneath our feet trembled. I stumbled, my grip on Lauren tightening as I tried to stay upright. The hotel was changing around us, reshaping itself into a maze designed to keep us trapped. But something about the way Harrington moved, slow, deliberate, gave me an idea. He wasn't fast, and he wasn't invincible. He was playing a game, toying with us, feeding off our fear, but he wasn't omnipotent. I pulled Lauren toward the window, which was still intact, despite the room twisting around us. "This way," I said, my voice hoarse with urgency. I wasn't sure how far it was to the ground. Maybe 2 stories, maybe more, but it didn't matter. We had to take our chances. I shoved the window open with all my strength. The old wood groaned in protest. Lauren hesitated for a second, her eyes wide with fear as she looked down, but there was no time to think. I grabbed her hand and helped her climb out, the cold night air hitting us like a slap. "Jump," I yelled, hoping that the ground below wasn't as hard as it seemed in the darkness. Lauren went first, dropping into the shadows below. I followed right after her, the icy wind rushing past me. For a second, I thought I'd miscalculated, that we were about to hit hard ground and break every bone in our bodies. But then we landed in a thick pile of leaves and overgrown weeds. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but we were alive. Somehow, we had made it out. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. Lauren was beside me, breathing hard, but she looked unhurt. We didn't say a word to each other as we took off running. We ran into the trees, the hotel looming behind us like a dark specter. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no time to process it. We had to get as far away from Riverside Lodge as possible. We ran until our legs burned, the thick forest swallowing us up. Branches scratched at our skin, and the ground was uneven, making it hard to keep our footing. But I didn't care. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see Harrington following us, his hollow eyes fixed on us, but the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Eventually, we had to stop. My chest felt like it was on fire, and Lauren was gasping for breath beside me. We collapsed against a fallen tree, both of us too exhausted to move. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the distant call of an owl and the soft whisper of the wind. It was surreal how peaceful the forest seemed compared to the nightmare we had just escaped. Finally, Lauren broke the silence. What the hell was that? Her voice was shaky, her usual confidence completely gone. I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're not going back there." Lauren nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. "We need to tell someone," she said. "The police? Or, no." I cut her off before she could finish. The last thing I wanted was to bring anyone else into this. Who would believe us anyway? An old hotel run by a ghost who could warp reality. They'd think we were crazy. And maybe we were. Maybe the hotel had gotten into our heads, made us see things that weren't real. But even as I thought that, I knew it wasn't true. Harrington was real. The hotel was real. And something about the way it twisted and shifted told me we weren't the first ones to experience it. As we sat there, trying to make sense of it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the dark forest, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. Still, the unease remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Lauren must have felt it too, because she suddenly stood up, brushing the dirt off her jeans. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice more steady now. "We need to keep moving." I agreed, though I wasn't sure where we were going. The nearest town was miles away, and we didn't have a map or even a phone signal out here. But anything was better than staying near that cursed hotel. We started walking again, this time at a slower pace. The adrenaline had worn off, and exhaustion was beginning to set in. My legs felt like lead, and every step was a struggle, but I forced myself to keep going. We had to keep moving. We had to get away. It was then that I noticed something strange. The trees around us were starting to look familiar. Too familiar. The same gnarled oak, the same fallen log. It was as if we were walking in circles. I stopped, my stomach twisting with dread. "Lauren," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We've been here before." She turned to me, confusion etched on her face. "What do you mean?" I pointed to the oak tree, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. "We passed that tree earlier, I'm sure of it." Lauren frowned, glancing around. "No, we've been going straight. We couldn't have." But I knew she could see it too. The realization hit us both at the same time. We weren't getting away. We were still trapped, somehow. The hotel wasn't just a building. It was a presence, a force that extended beyond its walls, and it wasn't going to let us go. Panic surged through me again. I grabbed Lauren's hand, pulling her forward. "We have to keep moving," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't stop." But no matter how far we walked, the trees never changed. The same landscape repeated over and over, as if we were trapped in some twisted loop. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. We were stuck, caught in the hotel's web, and the more we struggled, the tighter it seemed to wrap around us. After what felt like hours, we finally stopped, collapsing to the ground in defeat. My entire body ached, and my head was spinning from exhaustion. Lauren was lying beside me, her breathing shallow. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that was clawing at my insides. "We're not getting out, are we?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Deep down, I knew the truth. We were never meant to leave. For a long time, we just sat there, the weight of our situation pressing down on us. I kept expecting Harrington to appear, his hollow eyes watching us, but the forest remained empty. It was worse, somehow, knowing that he didn't need to chase us. We were already caught, but then, something changed. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in the air, a subtle change in the atmosphere. The oppressive weight that had been suffocating us lifted. Just a little, and I realized that the trees were different. We were no longer in the same repeating loop. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. "Lauren, look." She stood up beside me, her eyes widening as she looked around. "How?" "I don't know," I said, cutting her off. "But we have to move, now." We started running again, not knowing where we were going, but determined to get as far away as possible. The forest seemed to open up around us, the trees thinning out, and for the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we had finally broken free. Maybe whatever force had been keeping us trapped was starting to weaken. But that hope was short-lived. As we ran, the landscape changed again, but this time, it wasn't the same looping forest. The trees gave way to a clearing, and in the center of that clearing stood a building. A building I recognized all too well. Riverside Lodge. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach lurching as I stared at the hotel looming ahead of us. The same peeling paint, the same crooked sign swaying in the breeze. It was impossible. We had been running for hours. There was no way we could have come back here. But there it was, standing before us, as though it had never let us leave in the first place. Lauren's face drained of color as she took in the sight. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this can't be happening." I wanted to scream, to tear at the ground beneath me in frustration, but I was too numb, too tired. The realization settled over me like a cold fog. There was no escape. The hotel wasn't just a building. It was something far worse. Something alive. Something that could manipulate time and space. It fed off the hopelessness and fear of those who stumbled into it. And it had us now, just like it had all the others who never checked out. I glanced at Lauren, seeing the despair in her eyes, but I couldn't let it take us. Not yet. "We can't go back in there," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "We can't let it win." She nodded, though she looked close to breaking. "But where do we go?" I didn't have an answer. My mind was a storm of confusion and terror, but there had to be a way out. There had to be something we hadn't tried yet. I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, my eyes darting from the tree line to the building, searching for any sign of an escape. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A figure was standing at the edge of the trees, partially hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought it was Harrington, but as the figure stepped forward, I realized it was someone else entirely. A woman, her hair long and gray, her face pale and worn. She was watching us, her eyes filled with something that looked like both pity and warning. I took a step toward her, my heart pounding. "Who are you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the hotel, her gaze lingering on the crooked sign. It was as though she had seen it 1,000 times before. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." My breath caught in my throat. "We didn't mean to. We didn't know." The woman nodded, her expression sad but knowing. No one ever does. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us heavy with unspoken truths. I wanted to ask her who she was, but I couldn't. Something in her eyes told me that I wouldn't like the answers. Still, I couldn't help myself. "How do we get out?" She shook her head slowly, her gaze flicking back to the building. "You don't." Lauren stepped forward, her voice desperate. "Please, there has to be a way. We can't stay here." The woman looked at her then, really looked at her, and I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition. "You've already stayed longer than you think." She said this quietly. A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" The woman hesitated for a long moment before speaking again. "Time doesn't work the same here," she said, her voice barely audible. "The longer you stay, the more you lose track. Days, months, years. They all blurred together." Lauren's face paled. "How long have we been here?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned her back to us, retreating into the shadows of the trees. "If you want to survive, you need to leave now," she called over her shoulder. "But know this. Riverside doesn't let go easily. And once you've crossed its threshold, part of you never leaves." And then she was gone, swallowed up by the forest, as if she had never been there at all. I stood frozen, her words sinking into my mind like a poison. "Once you've crossed its threshold, part of you never leaves." What did that mean? Were we already too late? Had the hotel already claimed us? Lauren grabbed my arm, pulling me out of my thoughts. "We have to go," she said urgently. "Now." I nodded, though my legs felt like they were made of lead. We turned and ran, heading back toward the trees, away from the clearing, away from the hotel. But no matter how fast we ran, the same sense of dread followed us, like a shadow we couldn't shake. And that's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, following us through the forest. I didn't dare look back. I knew what I would see. Charles Harrington, grinning that same hollow grin, his dead eyes fixed on us, his presence growing closer with every step we took. He wasn't going to let us go. The hotel wasn't going to let us go. Lauren must have heard it too, because she started running faster. Her breath came in ragged gasps. "Don't stop," she panted. "Don't look back." But I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, Harrington, his figure growing larger as he closed the distance between us, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. My heart slammed against my ribs, and for a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. But then I remembered something the woman had said. If you want to survive, you need to leave now. We couldn't stop. We couldn't let him catch us. We burst through the tree line, emerging onto a narrow road. My legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running, pulling Lauren along with me. The sound of footsteps faded, but I knew better than to slow down. Harrington wouldn't give up that easily. The road was dark and empty, stretching out before us like an endless ribbon. I had no idea where it led, but it didn't matter. We had to keep going. We had to get as far away from Riverside Lodge as possible. As we ran, the trees on either side of the road blurred together, and the wind howled in our ears. But then, up ahead, I saw something, a faint glimmer of light. It was small, barely visible in the distance, but it was there, a sign of civilization, a sign of hope. Lauren saw it too, and her pace quickened. "We're almost there," she gasped. We pushed ourselves harder, our bodies screaming in protest, until we finally reached the source of the light. It was a small gas station, the neon sign flickering above the building, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. There was no one around, but the door was unlocked, and we stumbled inside, collapsing onto the cold tile floor. For a long time, we just lay there, too exhausted to move, too terrified to believe we had really escaped. But as the minutes ticked by, and no footsteps followed us, I finally allowed myself to hope. Lauren was the first to speak, her voice shaky, but relieved. "We made it." I nodded, though a part of me still couldn't believe it. The hotel, Harrington. It all felt like a nightmare, something that couldn't possibly be real. But the fear, the terror, it was all too real. And I knew, deep down, that even though we had escaped, we would never truly be free. The gas station was quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. I got to my feet, my legs trembling, and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The road stretched out before us, empty and silent, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I couldn't see the hotel. But then I looked closer. There, in the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a faint, flickering light. My heart stopped. It was the sign, the crooked, swaying sign of Riverside Lodge. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. How was it possible? We had run 4 miles, escaped the forest, reached the gas station, but no matter how far we went, the hotel was still there, waiting, watching. Lauren noticed my expression and hurried to the window. She followed my gaze, and I saw the same realization dawn in her eyes. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't be." But it was. Riverside Lodge was still with us. I turned away from the window, my mind racing. There was no escaping it, no outrunning it. The hotel had us now, just like it had everyone else who had ever crossed its threshold. We were never going to leave. Next story. I've always liked things to be predictable. It's comforting in a way. Routine shapes your life, giving it structure. You know what to expect each day, and nothing really catches you off guard. It sounds boring to some people, I know, but for me, That steady normalcy is all I've ever wanted. I live alone. It's not as depressing as it sounds. I enjoyed the solitude. No one to answer to, no one to share space with. Just me, my books, my plants, and a little apartment that sits on the edge of the city, where I can still hear the faint hum of life outside, without being in the middle of it. The neighbors keep to themselves. There's the occasional small talk in the elevator, but it never goes beyond that. Perfect, as far as I'm concerned. The apartment itself is modest. It has everything I need. A small kitchen with a round wooden table, a cozy living room with a couple of bookshelves, and one bedroom, sparsely decorated. The walls are pale, and I've added little personal touches. Photographs of the places I've traveled, a couple of paintings I bought at a flea market, plants that are surprisingly thriving despite my lack of a green thumb. The whole place feels calm, peaceful, almost untouched by the world outside. I've worked from home for the past year, managing customer service inquiries for a large company that no one's ever heard of. It's dull, repetitive work, but it pays the bills, and it allows me to maintain my quiet lifestyle. My routine was simple. Wake up, make coffee, answer emails, take a walk in the evening, and wind down with a book before bed. Every day was the same. I liked it that way. But then the package came. It was an ordinary Tuesday, as far as I remember. I was halfway through answering a particularly tedious inquiry when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Delivery drivers usually just left packages at the front of the building for us to retrieve. Curious, I got up from my desk and walked to the door. There was no one there, just a small brown box sitting on the mat. I glanced down the hallway, but it was empty. No sound, no footsteps retreating. Just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights in the corridor. The box had no markings on it, no shipping label or return address. It was plain, almost like someone had placed it there by hand. I picked it up. It wasn't heavy, but something shifted inside as I carried it back. The cardboard felt old, worn, as if it had been handled many times before. I set it down on the kitchen table and stared at it for a moment, a strange feeling settling over me. There was something about the box that made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a pair of scissors from the drawer and sliced through the tape. The flaps of the box fell open, revealing layers of tissue paper, carefully wrapped around whatever was inside. I pulled back the paper, and there it was. A doll. It was small, maybe a foot tall, made of porcelain with fine brown hair, and a delicate white dress. Its eyes were glassy and wide, staring up at me blankly. The craftsmanship was impressive, old-fashioned, and intricate. For a moment, I wondered if someone had sent it as a gift, but that didn't make sense. No one knew my address, and I hadn't ordered anything recently. There was no note, no indication of where it had come from. The longer I looked at the doll, the more uneasy I felt. Its face was expressionless, but there was something unsettling about the way its eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. It was just a doll, after all, nothing more. I placed it on the shelf next to a couple of old books and left it there, thinking I'd figure out what to do with it later. If only I had gotten rid of it right then. The first night I had the doll, I slept poorly. I've never had trouble falling asleep. In fact, it's usually the easiest part of my day. The moment I close my eyes, I drift off into a peaceful slumber, my mind blissfully quiet. But that night was different. I kept waking up, not from a nightmare or noise, but from a strange feeling, a prickling awareness that something wasn't quite right. I'd open my eyes in the dark, and my heart would be pounding, though I couldn't remember why. Each time, I'd glance around the room, see nothing out of place. I'd roll over, trying to settle back into sleep, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. The next morning, I was groggy, the kind of grogginess that makes everything feel distant, like you're walking through water. I went about my routine as usual, pushing aside the unease from the night before. I told myself it was nothing, just a bad night's sleep, but things started to get stranger. A few days later, I came home from my evening walk to find the doll in a different position. It was subtle. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, and its hands, which I remembered being delicately placed in its lap, were now resting on the edge of the shelf. At first, I thought I must have bumped into the shelf without realizing it, but the more I stared at it, the more certain I became that I hadn't touched it at all. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the doll, trying to shake the growing sense of discomfort that was creeping into my chest. I even walked over to the shelf and adjusted its position, putting its hands back where they had been, straightening its head, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a doll. It couldn't move. But the unease lingered. Over the next few days, more strange things started happening. Little things at first. Objects in the apartment were slightly out of place. Doors that I was sure I had closed were suddenly open. The feeling of being watched growing stronger with each passing night. And then, one night, I woke up again, my heart pounding for no reason. It was the middle of the night, the apartment bathed in darkness. The silence pressed in around me, but this time there was something else. A noise. It was faint, barely audible at first, a soft tapping sound coming from the living room. I lay still, my breath caught in my throat, straining to listen. The tapping continued, rhythmic, deliberate. It was as if someone or something was tapping on the glass of the coffee table. I didn't want to get up. Every instinct in my body told me to stay in bed, to pull the covers over my head and pretend I hadn't heard it. But I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I slid out from under the blankets and padded silently toward the living room. The tapping stopped as soon as I entered the room. I stood there in the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the dim light coming from the street lamp outside. Everything looked normal at first glance. The books on the shelf, the coffee table, the plants in the corner. And then I saw it. The doll was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting in the middle of the coffee table, its tiny hands resting on the glass, its head tilted to the side in that same unsettling way. Its eyes, those glassy, wide eyes, were staring directly at me. I froze. My mind raced. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't touched it since that day. I placed it on the shelf. How did the rational part of my brain kicked in? I told myself it must have fallen. Maybe I had knocked it over when I was moving things around. Maybe I had forgotten placing it there earlier, but the unease in my chest told me otherwise. I quickly picked up the doll and placed it back on the shelf, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of growing dread. I tried to go about my routine as usual, but it was impossible. Every time I walked past the shelf, the doll's eyes seemed to follow me. Every night, I woke up to that same tapping sound, growing louder and more insistent. And every morning, I found the doll in a different spot, sometimes on the coffee table, sometimes on the floor, once even perched on the kitchen counter, as if it had been watching me eat breakfast. I couldn't take it anymore. I thought about getting rid of it. In fact, I came close more than once, but something stopped me every time. I'd pick it up, feel the weight of it in my hands, and then hesitate. There was something about the doll that seemed to anchor it to the apartment, to me. No matter how much I wanted it gone, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. The strange sensation that it was always watching never left. I thought about the doll constantly. Even when I wasn't looking at it, I felt its presence, lingering in my mind like a heavy weight I couldn't shake. During the day, I went through the motions of my usual routine, answering emails, making small meals, going for walks. But everything felt off-kilter, like my life had been slightly tilted, and I was the only one who noticed. The doll was always there in the back of my mind, a quiet presence that seemed to be waiting for something. I started to avoid the living room. It was irrational, But I couldn't bring myself to sit on the couch, couldn't stand to be near that shelf where the doll sat in its eerie stillness. Every time I passed by, I felt its glassy eyes on me, watching, waiting. I tried moving it into the closet, but that made things worse. After an hour, I convinced myself I could hear faint shuffling from inside the closet door. I opened it, and of course, the doll was sitting just where I had placed it, unmoving, lifeless. At least, that's what I told myself. By the third week, my nerves were completely frayed. I wasn't sleeping. Every night I woke up to that same tapping sound, louder and more aggressive. I had tried sleeping with earplugs, playing white noise, anything to drown it out, but nothing worked. The tapping always cut through the silence, and every night, without fail, the doll had moved. Its tiny body would be perched somewhere new, its lifeless hands tapping softly on the nearest surface. The strangest part was, I never saw it move. No matter how vigilant I was, no matter how much I watched it, the doll remained perfectly still in my presence. But somehow, it always ended up in a different place. I knew I wasn't imagining it, though I desperately wished I was. It was late one evening when I finally decided I couldn't take it any longer. I had just finished a dinner I barely touched, and as I stood at the kitchen sink washing the dishes, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I knew, without looking, that the doll had moved again. It was a familiar feeling by now, that sinking dread that came from realizing the doll was not where I had left it. But this time, I couldn't bring myself to look. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands, and walked stiffly toward the living room. The moment I stepped into the room, my breath caught in my throat. The doll was sitting on the couch, right in the spot where I usually sat to read. Its hands were folded neatly in its lap, its head slightly tilted as if it were listening for something, its glassy eyes fixed on the empty space beside it. The sight of it sitting there, in the exact spot where I spent so much of my time, sent a cold chill racing down my spine. This wasn't just a trick anymore. It wasn't just something that could be explained away. It wasn't sleepwalking or carelessness. The doll was moving on its own, and it wanted something. It had to. I stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. My rational mind kept telling me to grab the doll, throw it out, burn it if I had to. But my body refused to move. It was as if the doll's cold, lifeless stare had pinned me in place. It felt like it was draining me of my will to act. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. My hands shook as I clenched them into fists. I couldn't keep living like this. I had to do something. Slowly, I forced myself to move. I took a step toward the couch, then another. The doll didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me like an oppressive fog. I stopped just in front of the couch, staring down at it. "I don't know what you are," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "but you need to leave. I don't want you here anymore." The doll didn't respond. Of course, it was just a doll, after all, a lifeless, inanimate object. But then, as I reached down to pick it up, I saw it, a faint crack running down the length of its porcelain face. I froze, my hand hovering just above its tiny body. The crack hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I had inspected the doll countless times, checking for any signs of damage. But now, there was a jagged fissure running from the corner of its right eye down to the edge of its chin, as if the doll had been broken and hastily repaired. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at the crack. A deep sense of unease settled in my stomach. Something was wrong, very wrong. I pulled my hand back, unable to bring myself to touch it. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, my mind racing, my body tense with fear. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that damn tapping noise, louder and closer than ever before. It felt like it was right outside my bedroom door, just waiting for me to open it. But I didn't. The next morning, I made up my mind. I was going to get rid of the doll, once and for all. I didn't care if it was irrational. I didn't care if I was overreacting. Whatever was happening, whether it was my mind playing tricks on me, or something more sinister, I needed it gone. I grabbed the doll from the couch, refusing to look too closely at its face, and wrapped it tightly in an old blanket. I shoved it into a cardboard box, taping the flaps shut with shaking hands. I didn't care where I took it, as long as it was far away from my apartment. I carried the box down the stairs and out to my car. I didn't even bother to lock the door behind me. I just wanted to be rid of it. As I drove, I kept glancing at the box in the passenger seat, half expecting it to start moving. But it didn't. It just sat there, silent and still. I drove aimlessly for a while, not sure where I was going. I didn't want to leave it in the trash. Somehow, that didn't feel right. But I couldn't bring myself to take it back home. Eventually, I found myself on the outskirts of town, near an old junkyard. It wasn't the most elegant solution, but it would have to do. I pulled over to the side of the road. I grabbed the box and walked toward the gates of the junkyard. The wind had picked up, blowing cold against my skin. As I approached the piles of rusted metal and discarded furniture, the place reeked of decay and neglect, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave the doll behind. I found a spot near a particularly large heap of twisted metal and dropped the box unceremoniously onto the ground. I stood there for a moment, staring down at it, half expecting something to happen, but nothing did. With a sigh of relief, I turned and walked back to my car. As I drove away, I felt lighter. The tension in my chest had eased, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The doll was gone. It was over, or so I thought. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in a long while. No tapping noises, no sense of being watched. Just quiet, restful sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining through the windows, and everything felt normal. I smiled to myself as I made breakfast, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The doll was gone. Whatever strange power it had over me, it was gone with it. I was free. But as the day went on, the feeling of relief began to fade. It was subtle at first, just a lingering discomfort that gnawed at the edges of my mind. But by the time the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was just the residual fear from the past few weeks. But the feeling kept creeping back, stronger and more insistent. I found myself glancing nervously at the bookshelf. I half expected to see it there again. And then, as the light outside faded to dusk, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't been expecting anyone. Slowly, I walked to the door, my stomach twisting with dread. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There was no one there, but sitting on the mat, wrapped in the same blanket I had used to discard it, was the doll. I stared down at it, my mind reeling. How was this possible? I had left it miles away, in the middle of a junkyard. I had seen it there with my own eyes, and yet, here it was, back on my doorstep. For a long moment, I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, none of which made sense. I was standing at my front door, staring down at the doll I had discarded the day before. There was no logical explanation for why it was here. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. The wind blew softly against my face from the open door, but it felt too cold, too sharp, like the air itself was mocking me. I knew I should pick it up. I knew I should do something. Anything. But I couldn't. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my chest tight with dread. The doll's glassy eyes, half hidden by the folds of the blanket, seemed to stare right through me, as if it knew. Knew everything. Knew more than I did. I closed the door. I didn't pick up the doll. Didn't bring it inside. I just shut the door and locked it. The rational part of my brain screamed at me, telling me that leaving it there would solve nothing. but I couldn't bring myself to touch it, not after everything. I turned away from the door and walked back into the apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in on me. I found myself avoiding the windows, not wanting to look outside, not wanting to see if the doll was still there. I kept telling myself it was impossible, just a trick, some sort of coincidence. Someone must have found it and thought it belonged to me. That had to be it. It couldn't have come back on its own. I didn't believe in that sort of thing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The hours ticked by slowly, each one filled with a growing sense of dread that gnawed at my insides. I tried to distract myself, but nothing worked. I couldn't focus. My mind kept returning to the doll, sitting outside, waiting. What did it want from me? Why was it here? When night fell, I turned on every light in the apartment, but the warmth of the lamps did nothing to ease the cold fear settling in my bones. I sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen, feeling as though the air itself was suffocating me. Then, the tapping started again. I froze. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. But then it grew louder, more distinct, like something hard was gently tapping on glass. My breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the front door. My heart raced, each thud echoing in my chest as I stood up, my legs unsteady. I moved toward the door, each step slow and careful, as though approaching something dangerous. The tapping continued, soft and rhythmic, a steady beat that made my skin crawl. I reached the door and stopped. The tapping ceased. I stood there, staring at the doorknob, afraid to open it, afraid to see what was on the other side. But I had to know. I had to see. I reached out, my hands shaking, and unlocked the door. The doll was gone. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The mat where the doll had been was empty, as if it had never been there at all. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. Where had it gone? Who had taken it? The tapping resumed, but this time it was coming from inside. I turned, slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was coming from the living room, from the window. My legs moved without thinking, my body propelled by pure instinct, as I made my way toward the sound. I didn't want to see, didn't want to know, but my body wouldn't listen. The tapping grew louder as I approached the window, the sound sharper now, more insistent. And there it was. The doll was sitting on the windowsill, its tiny hands pressed against the glass, tapping softly. Its head was tilted slightly, its glassy eyes reflecting the dim light from the room. But what terrified me most was the crack. The crack that had appeared on its face the night before had grown larger, jagged now, splitting its porcelain face almost in two. But instead of revealing more porcelain beneath, the crack revealed something else, something dark, something that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The room spun, my mind reeling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The doll tilted its head further. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. And then it spoke. "You can't get rid of me," it whispered, the voice faint but unmistakable. "You belong to me now." I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the doll as those words echoed in my mind. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible. Dolls didn't speak. Dolls didn't move on their own. And yet, it was happening. I had to get out. I had to leave. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs refused to move. The doll's voice rang in my ears, a quiet, insistent whisper that burrowed into my skull. "You can't leave. You belong to me." With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to be far away from that thing. I grabbed my coat and keys, throwing open the door and running out into the hallway, not stopping until I reached my car. My heart was racing, my hands shaking so badly, I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I didn't even bother to think about where I was driving. All I knew was that I needed to be as far away from that apartment as possible. The city lights blurred as I sped through the empty streets, my mind a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief. Eventually, I found myself parked in front of a small diner on the outskirts of town. It was late, and the place was nearly empty, but I needed to be around people, needed to feel some sense of normalcy. I walked inside, the bell above the door jingling softly as I stepped in. The waitress gave me a tired smile and led me to a booth near the back. I sat down, still trembling, my eyes darting nervously around the room. The warmth of the diner was a stark contrast to the cold fear that clung to me like a second skin. I ordered a cup of coffee, but I didn't drink it. My mind was still back at the apartment, replaying everything that had happened over and over again. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. "You all right there?" I looked up to see the waitress standing by my table, her brow furrowed in concern. I must have looked terrible, pale, shaking, wide-eyed. I forced a small smile, nodding. "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding hollow. "Just rough day." She nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Well, if you need anything, just holler." I nodded again, watching as she walked back behind the counter. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax. The soft hum of conversation in the diner, the clatter of dishes, the low murmur of the radio. Everything felt normal here, safe. But it didn't last. As I sat there, staring blankly at my untouched coffee, I felt it again. That prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up slowly, my heart sinking in my chest. There, sitting on the counter, was the doll. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. It couldn't be. I had left it behind. I had run. There was no way it could be here. And yet, it was. The waitress passed by the counter without even glancing at it, as if she didn't see it. No one in the diner seemed to notice. It was just me. I was the only one who saw it. I stood up abruptly, knocking my coffee cup to the floor. The clatter drew the attention of a few nearby patrons, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. As I backed away from the booth, I heard the tapping again. Soft, rhythmic, coming from the counter where the doll sat. "You can't get rid of me," the voice whispered again, low and menacing. "You belong to me." I turned and ran, bursting through the door and into the cold night air. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I couldn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't stay here. I had nowhere to go. I didn't sleep that night. I drove aimlessly, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, where to go. All I knew was that the doll wasn't just a thing anymore. It was something else, something alive, something that had its hooks in me, and I couldn't escape it. By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted. I pulled over on a quiet stretch of road, my body heavy with fatigue. I couldn't run forever. I couldn't keep driving aimlessly, hoping the doll would just disappear. I needed to face it, whatever it was. But as I sat there, staring blankly out the window, I realized something. The doll wasn't the problem. It never had been. The tapping, the movements, the whispering. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was all in my head. The stress, the sleepless nights, the isolation. It had gotten to me. I had let my mind spiral, let my fear consume me. The doll was just a doll. I took a deep breath, my hands still trembling slightly. I started the car again. I had to go back. I had to face it. I couldn't keep running from something that wasn't real. The drive back to my apartment was slow, the weight of my own realization sinking in. I had created this nightmare. I had let it take over my life. But now, I was going to take control. When I reached my apartment, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the floor as I stepped inside. The air felt different now, lighter, Somehow, the doll was still sitting on the windowsill, just as I had left it. It was still cracked, its glassy eyes still staring blankly into the room. But now, I saw it for what it really was. An object. Just porcelain. Just paint. Nothing more. I walked over to it, my heart steady, my mind clear. I picked it up, feeling the cool weight of it in my hands. The crack along its face looked so small now, so insignificant. I smiled, a sense of calm settling over me. I belonged to no one, I whispered. With that, I carried the doll to the kitchen, placed it in the trash, and closed the lid. Finally, it was over. Next story. I don't know why we chose that night to go to the carnival. Maybe it was the oppressive boredom that had settled over our small town that summer. The kind of boredom that creeps in with the heat and lingers like thick humidity. Maybe it was the way stories about the old fairgrounds always seemed to be whispered. Or maybe it was just that deep-seated teenage urge to push boundaries, to test the edges of fear and thrill all at once. Whatever the reason, we found ourselves standing in front of the rusted gates of the abandoned carnival, squinting through the overgrown weeds and vines that seemed to choke the life out of the place. There were 4 of us. Me, Kyle, Jess, and Mason. We'd been friends for years, ever since grade school, and we knew each other better than anyone else in this town of crumbling sidewalks. Kyle was the loud one, the instigator, always the first to throw out an idea that we'd all regret later. Jess was more cautious, but her curiosity often got the better of her. Mason was the quiet one, but he followed Kyle's lead without question, like he was trying to prove something. And then there was me, the observer, the one who went along with everything but always kept an eye on the exits. The carnival had been abandoned for years, or so we thought. It was just on the outskirts of town, a place no one ever seemed to mention, unless they were trying to scare someone. I had never seen it up close before that night. From a distance, it looked like a forgotten relic from another time. Twisted metal and faded signs advertising games no one would ever play again. Up close, it felt different. The rust on the rides gleamed under the moonlight, and the air felt thick with something I couldn't quite place. It was quiet, too quiet, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for someone. Kyle grinned as he pulled a crowbar from his backpack and jammed it into the padlock on the gate. With a grunt, he pried it open, and the gates swung inward, with a creak that echoed in the still night air. He turned to us, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Come on," he said. "Let's check it out." Jess hesitated, glancing at me with a nervous smile. "Are we really doing this?" I shrugged, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. "Why not? It's just an old carnival. What's the worst that could happen?" I had no idea. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Stale popcorn mixed with something rotten, like old trash left to bake in the sun. The midway stretched out in front of us, the booths lined up as if waiting for customers. The games were still there, or at least what was left of them. Old wooden signs advertised ring tosses, shooting galleries, and the kind of impossible two-win challenges that carnivals were known for. The prizes were long gone, but the eerie way the booths stood, as if frozen in time, gave me chills. We moved deeper into the carnival, our footsteps echoing on the cracked asphalt. It didn't feel right. The atmosphere felt oppressive, like the air was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone watching us from the shadows. But the place was deserted. Or, it should have been. "Man, this place is creepy," Jess muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Why did it close down, anyway?" Mason, who had been unusually quiet, cleared his throat. "People say there was an accident. Some ride malfunctioned. A couple of people died. After that, they just shut the place down." "Yeah, but that was like 30 years ago," Kyle chimed in. "Place is ancient history. You think they would have cleared it out by now. You know, sell the land or something." I nodded, but my gut told me otherwise. Something about the carnival felt too preserved, as if it hadn't been left to time like an old building should. The rust on the rides, the cracked paint, the weathered booths, they all looked just damaged enough to suggest abandonment, but not enough to feel real. It was like the carnival was stuck in limbo, suspended in the moment before it closed, waiting for us. As we walked, the tension seemed to thicken around us. A breeze blew through, but instead of refreshing the stifling air, it carried a faint noise, music. My skin prickled. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as we moved farther into the park, I realized it was coming from deeper inside. It was faint, like an old record playing far away, but unmistakably carnival music, the kind that usually came from carousels. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Kyle laughed. "Oh man, this is perfect. They probably just left some old speaker on, you know? It's not like anyone comes out here. Must have been on for years." But Jess wasn't laughing. "That doesn't make sense. That speaker would have died a long time ago." Kyle shrugged. "Who cares? Let's check it out. Maybe the carousel's still standing. That'd be cool." He started moving in the direction of the music, and against my better judgment, I followed. The closer we got, the louder the music became, until we reached the heart of the carnival. There it was, the carousel. It was in surprisingly good condition compared to the rest of the park. The horses, their chipped paint still bright in some places, stood frozen in mid-gallop, their eyes wide and glossy. The whole thing was still turning, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if it hadn't stopped since the day the carnival closed. My breath hitched as I realized there was no one running it. The platform moved on its own, the music echoing hollowly around us. Jess backed away, her voice shaky. This isn't normal. How is it still running? There's no power here." I took a step closer to the carousel, peering at the mechanics underneath. There was no engine noise, no visible source of power. My pulse quickened. The whole place felt wrong, like it was alive, feeding off our presence. Mason whispered, "We should go." I nodded, but Kyle shook his head. "No way, man. We just got here. Besides, look." He pointed ahead, where the carnival's funhouse loomed. Its brightly colored facade was peeling, but the lights above the entrance were flickering to life, one by one. "That's impossible," Jess whispered. Kyle ignored her, already heading toward the entrance. "Come on, this is awesome. Maybe the whole place is still running." That was when I noticed it. The flicker of movement in the funhouse's mirrored windows. A figure, standing still, watching us. My heart jumped into my throat. "I saw something," I said, grabbing Kyle's arm. He stopped and turned to me, eyebrows raised. "What? There's nothing there." I glanced back at the funhouse, my chest tightening. The figure was gone. Maybe it had never been there. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. "I don't think we should go in there," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Kyle laughed again, his usual bravado kicking in. "Oh, come on. You're not scared, are you?" But I was. And as the rest of them moved toward the funhouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us inside. We hesitated at the entrance, its garish colors unsettling under the pale moonlight. The flickering lights cast distorted shadows, making the clown face above the door leer. I could hear the faint creak of the carousel behind us, still turning, still playing its eerie, endless tune. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place, and never look back. But Kyle had already stepped inside, and Mason followed, without hesitation. "Are we really doing this?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer because I didn't know. There was a pull, something inexplicable, that made me follow them into the funhouse, even though every instinct told me I shouldn't. The moment we stepped through the door, the temperature seemed to drop. It was pitch black inside, save for the occasional flicker of light from the mirrors lining the walls. "Where's the power coming from?" Jess whispered. Kyle didn't seem to care. He was already laughing, his voice echoing in the narrow hallway. "This is awesome. It's like the place never shut down." I forced myself to keep moving, staying close to Jess as we navigated the twisting corridors, mirrors reflecting endless versions of ourselves. The funhouse was designed to disorient, with walls shifting when touched, floors tilting under our weight. But there was something else, beyond the usual tricks of light and sound. I kept catching glimpses of movement in the mirrors, shadows darting too quickly to be one of us. I tried to convince myself it was the funhouse, but deep down, I knew better. "Guys," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, "we need to get out of here." But Kyle was already ahead, deeper into the maze, his laughter growing distant. Jess was shaking beside me, and even Mason looked nervous now, his eyes darting around the narrow passageway, as if waiting for something to jump out at us. That was when the mirrors started to shift. At first, I thought it was another trick of the funhouse, an illusion to mess with our perception. But then I realized the mirrors were moving on their own, sliding across the floor, rearranging themselves until the corridor was blocked in both directions. I turned to Jess, panic rising in my throat. "Did you see that?" She nodded, her face pale. "What's happening?" I didn't have an answer. The funhouse had become a maze, and there was no way out. The mirrors closed in around us, reflecting our terrified faces back at us, over and over again, until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. My heart pounded in my chest, and the air felt thick. Then, from somewhere deep within the funhouse, I heard Kyle scream. It wasn't a playful scream. It wasn't a sound of excitement or thrill. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. "Kyle," I shouted, but there was no answer. Mason bolted toward the direction of the scream, and Jess grabbed my arm, pulling me with her. "We need to find him," she cried. We ran through the shifting corridors, the mirrors blurring around us, making it impossible to tell which way we were going. Kyle's screams echoed through the funhouse, growing louder, then cutting off abruptly. We stopped dead in our tracks, the sudden silence more terrifying than the scream itself. "Where is he?" Mason panted, his eyes wild. I scanned the mirrors, looking for any sign of Kyle. That's when I saw him, his reflection, standing just behind us. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. I turned back to the mirror. Kyle was still there, standing perfectly still, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong," I whispered, backing away from the mirror. Jess grabbed my hand, her grip tight. "What do you mean?" "Look at him," I said, pointing to the reflection. "That's not him. That's not really him." Mason stared at the reflection, his face going pale. "What the hell is happening?" Before I could answer, the reflection of Kyle began to move. Slowly at first, like he was being controlled by something unseen. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. And then he smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched too far across his face. My blood ran cold. Jess screamed. I turned to run, pulling Jess with me, but the mirrors closed in around us again, trapping us. Mason banged on the glass, shouting, but it was no use. We were stuck. Then, I heard it, a voice, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Stay, stay, and play." It wasn't Kyle's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. But it was coming from the mirrors, echoing all around us. I turned to Jess, panic in my voice. "We need to get out of here. Now." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Mason was still pounding on the mirrors, but it was no use. The funhouse wasn't going to let us go. Not without a fight. Suddenly, the mirrors parted, revealing a narrow passageway leading deeper into the funhouse. I didn't trust it, but it was our only way out. I grabbed Jess's hand and ran, with Mason close behind us. The passage twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the heart of the funhouse. The walls seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder with each step. At the end of the passage was a door, an old, rusted thing with a faded sign that read "Exit." But as we reached for the handle, I heard it again, the voice, louder this time. "Stay, stay, and play." I froze. The handle was ice cold under my hand. Jess pulled at my arm, desperate. "Come on, we need to go." But something stopped me. I turned, looking back at the mirrors, where Kyle's reflection still stood, watching us with that unnatural smile. And then, in the blink of an eye, his reflection wasn't there anymore. The door creaked open. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. On the other side was a stairwell, descending into darkness. I hesitated, my hand still on the handle, trying to make sense of everything. The mirrors, the voices, Kyle's reflection. It didn't add up, but there wasn't time to think. Jess was pulling on my arm, desperate to leave, and Mason's breath was coming out in shallow, panicked gasps. We needed to move. We stepped into the stairwell, and the door slammed shut behind us, with a deafening bang. The air down here was different, heavy and cold, with the unmistakable smell of damp earth. There was something worse, too. Something metallic. Blood. I wasn't sure, but I could taste it in the back of my throat. There was no light, save for the faint glow of our phones. But it was enough to see the walls were lined with old posters. Carnival advertisements. Faded and torn, but just visible enough to make out the words. "Come see the Carnival of Lost Dreams." One poster read, "Where your wildest fantasies come true." Another one, in worse shape, advertised the funhouse of mirrors, with the promise that nothing is as it seems. No kidding, I thought bitterly. We kept moving down the stairs, the silence broken only by our footsteps. The distant hum of that same cursed carnival music began again. The further we went down, the louder it became, pounding in my ears, relentless and maddening. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. We just hadn't found it yet. But then we reached the bottom, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. The room was large, with low arched ceilings, and walls covered in faded carnival posters. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate carousel, just like the one we'd seen outside. But this one was different. The horses were grotesque, their faces twisted in expressions of agony, their eyes wide and staring. The platform spun slowly, creaking with each rotation, and strapped to one of the horses was Kyle. He was alive, but barely. His head lolled to the side, and his eyes were glassy, unfocused. His mouth hung open, his lips cracked and dry, as if he had been screaming for hours. His arms and legs were bound to the horse. The thick leather straps held him in place as the carousel turned. Jess screamed and ran toward him, but Mason grabbed her, holding her back. "Don't. We don't know what's going on." But I couldn't just stand there. I ran to the carousel, my heart pounding in my chest. Kyle, can you hear me?" He didn't respond. His eyes didn't even flicker. I grabbed the straps, trying to loosen them, but they wouldn't budge. They were too tight, too thick. The carousel continued to spin, the music growing louder, more frantic. I looked around, searching for something, anything that could help. There had to be a way to stop it. That's when I saw the switch. It was an old, rusted lever, mounted on the wall beside the carousel. The paint around it was chipped and faded, but I could just make out the words, "Emergency stop." I ran to it, my hands shaking. Without thinking, I pulled the lever down with all my strength. The music stopped. The carousel ground to a halt, the horses' grotesque faces frozen in mid-motion. Kyle slumped forward, his head falling against the horse's neck, but he was still breathing. Jess and Mason rushed to his side, frantically undoing the straps that held him in place. I stood there, staring at the carousel, my mind racing. Something didn't feel right. And then, I heard the voice again. Stay, stay, and play. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't coming from the mirrors. It was coming from Kyle. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. Jess and Mason were too focused on untying him to notice, but I saw it. I saw the way his lips moved, the faint whisper of that same voice that had haunted us all night. It wasn't Kyle anymore. Whatever this place was, it had taken him. He wasn't himself. He hadn't been himself since the moment we stepped into the funhouse. Mason, I whispered, my voice shaking. We need to go now. But it was too late. Kyle's eyes snapped open, and the smile that spread across his face was the same twisted, unnatural smile I'd seen in the mirrors. Jess screamed as Kyle's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with inhuman strength. Mason lunged at him, trying to pull him off, but Kyle, or whatever he had become, was too strong. I watched in horror as Kyle stood, dragging Jess toward the carousel, his grip tightening as she struggled against him. "Mason," I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. "We have to get out of here." Mason hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at Jess, then at me, and I saw the moment he made his decision. With one last desperate glance at Jess, he turned and ran toward the stairwell. I followed, my heart pounding in my ears, the sound of Jess's screams echoing behind us. We bolted up the stairs, our footsteps slamming against the metal steps. The music had started again, louder and more frenzied than before. It was like the whole carnival was coming alive, feeding off the terror that was coursing through us. We reached the top of the stairs and burst through the door, back into the funhouse. But it wasn't the same. The mirrors were gone, replaced by walls of metal and wire. The path was clear now, a straight shot to the exit. I didn't question it. I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out. Mason and I ran, our breaths ragged, our bodies aching from the exertion. The exit loomed ahead, a small rectangle of light at the end of the tunnel. We were almost there, almost free, but then, just as we reached the door, I heard it, Jess's voice. "Help me, please, help me." I froze. Mason grabbed my arm, his face pale. "It's not her," he said, his voice shaking. "You know it's not her." I knew he was right, but the sound of her voice, the desperation in it, I couldn't leave her. I turned back, my heart aching with the weight of what I had to do. "I'm sorry," I whispered, as I turned away from the door and stepped back into the carnival. The door slammed shut behind me. With the carnival now locked behind me, a suffocating silence fell. The echoes of Jess's screams and the mechanical grinding of the carousel faded away, leaving only the soft hum of the carnival's presence. It felt like a living thing, lurking in the shadows. I stood there, knowing what I had chosen, knowing there was no turning back. But the strangest part of it all, the carnival didn't want me dead. It wanted me to stay. It had always wanted us to stay. Next story. There are moments in life that stretch out like a thread, pulling you toward something, though you can't quite place what it is. That was how I felt when I got the idea to take that trip. The same highway, the same countryside I'd driven through 100 times before. It was familiar, safe. That's what I kept telling myself. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and 3 friends. There was Eric, my best friend since high school. He could make anyone laugh, even when they didn't want to. Eric was always the first to suggest a new adventure, even though he wasn't as brave as he liked to pretend. Then there was Carrie, sharp but cool, laid back, the balance to Eric's wild side. And finally, Jason, quiet, observant. He'd be the one to keep his head in an emergency. We packed up Eric's beat-up SUV, filled it with drinks, sandwiches, and a half-baked plan. We were headed out into the mountains for a camping trip. Eric found a remote spot online. The perfect place to disconnect, he said. And we all jumped at the idea of leaving behind phones, emails, responsibilities for a few days. The road stretched out ahead, winding through fields, bordered by tall trees. We took turns driving, laughing at old stories, debating music, and teasing Eric about his terrible playlist. It felt like one of those weekends where everything was going to be all right, the world full of possibilities. But now, looking back, I see the signs were there from the start. I didn't recognize them at the time. At first it was nothing, just little things. Eric swerved to avoid hitting a raccoon. We laughed it off, but the raccoon had strange, glazed eyes and didn't run off after we passed. It just stood there, watching. Jason mentioned it was odd, but we didn't think much of it. When the sun set, the GPS on my phone stopped working. No signal. We were too far into the middle of nowhere, I thought, but an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. There's something about a highway at dusk. The way it stretches out like a river of asphalt, disappearing into the horizon. It's as if the road itself is alive, shifting and breathing, waiting for you to go too far. The first real sign that something was wrong came hours later. We'd been driving for what felt like forever, and it was getting dark. The headlights barely cut through the fog. The fog came out of nowhere, swallowing the road, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Maybe we should stop for the night, Carrie suggested from the back seat. It's late, and this fog isn't letting up. Jason checked the time. We should be close to that campsite Eric found. Can't be more than 20 minutes away. Eric muttered something, squinting ahead, pretending to know the way. I was about to call him out when we saw him. A hitchhiker, standing at the edge of the road, just outside the headlight's beam. He was tall, wearing a heavy coat that seemed out of place for the time of year. A faded baseball cap obscured most of his face, but I could see a scraggly beard beneath it. He stood there, motionless, with one hand raised in a lazy gesture, thumb pointing up. Dude, no way, Eric said, shaking his head. I'm not picking up some random guy in the middle of nowhere. Jason was more considerate. He doesn't look dangerous. Maybe he just needs a ride into town. We're not going into town, Eric shot back, clearly on edge. We're going camping, remember? Have you ever seen a horror movie? This is how they start, Carrie chimed in. We can't leave him out here. I don't know why I said it, but I did. Let's see what he wants. Maybe it was the way he stood there, unmoving, or the fog closing in, making the world outside seem distant and unreal. Or maybe it was that nagging feeling that something was off. Eric slowed the car to a stop. The man stepped forward, his face weathered, clothes dirty. His pale blue eyes were unsettling, cold, like he was sizing us up. Where you headed? Eric called out, trying to sound casual. The man didn't answer right away. He looked at each of us in turn, his eyes lingering a second too long on me. Mind if I ride with you for a bit? His voice was low and gravelly, with an accent I couldn't place. Eric hesitated, glancing at me in the rearview mirror, then at Carrie. She shrugged. Fine. Eric sighed, unlocking the doors. The man slid into the back seat next to Carrie, and the tension in the car thickened. He didn't offer a name, didn't say much at all as we started moving again. I kept sneaking glances at him in the rearview mirror, but he just stared out the window, his face hidden under the brim of his hat. The fog pressed against the windows like something alive, and the road ahead seemed endless, dark. The further we drove, the more lost we seemed to become. It felt like we were driving into nothing, the world outside dissolving into shadows. It wasn't until we passed the same broken-down sign for the third time that I realized we were going in circles. That's the same sign, Jason said, his voice tight. We've passed it 3 times now. Eric swore under his breath, gripping the steering wheel. I'm telling you, the GPS isn't working. This fog, I don't know where we are. The hitchhiker hadn't said a word since getting in, but now he leaned forward, his voice low. You're not going the right way. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. What do you mean? I've been on this road before, he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light. You took a wrong turn. You're heading into the forest. Eric laughed nervously. Well, thanks for the heads up. I'll just turn around. No, the hitchhiker said, his voice firm. It's too late for that. The air in the car grew thick, and the atmosphere shifted. I could feel my heart starting to race, and I glanced at Carrie. Her face was pale. What do you mean? It's too late? I asked, my voice more shaky than I intended. The hitchhiker smiled, thin and crooked. Once you're on this road, there's no turning back. It's a place people don't come back from. Eric's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. What the hell are you talking about? The hitchhiker didn't answer, but the silence in the car was enough. His words hung in the air, and none of us could shake the heavy sense of dread that had settled over us. Eric tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. We'll be fine. It's just a road. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear creeping in. We kept driving, but the further we went, the thicker the fog became. The hitchhiker sat back, his cold gaze never leaving the road ahead. No one spoke. The car was suffocating with tension. The road seemed to stretch on forever. The hitchhiker finally broke the silence. You're already too far in, he muttered. I glanced at Carrie. Her face was pale, and she was gripping her seat like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. I could feel my pulse quickening. Too far in for what? I asked, my voice shaky. The hitchhiker's eyes glinted in the rearview mirror. To leave, he said. The road doesn't let you leave. His words sent a chill down my spine. What did he mean? The road wouldn't let us leave. It was absurd, but the way he said it, with such certainty, made my stomach twist. I glanced at Eric, hoping for some reassurance, but his face was pale, his jaw clenched. We kept driving, but with every passing minute, the tension in the car grew unbearable. The fog was thicker than ever. Then, without warning, Eric slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, the headlights cutting through the thick fog, illuminating nothing but the void. That's it, Eric said, his voice trembling. I'm turning round. He shifted the car into reverse, but before he could move, the hitchhiker leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. I wouldn't do that if I were you, he said. It's too late. What the hell do you mean, too late? Eric snapped, his voice rising with panic. We can't just stay here. The hitchhiker smiled, a cold, thin smile that made my skin crawl. You don't understand, he said softly. The road has already taken you. Eric's hands trembled on the steering wheel. Taken us. He repeated, his voice shaky. What are you talking about? We're still here. We're still alive. The hitchhiker leaned back, his eyes gleaming. You won't be for long, he said quietly. His words hit like a punch to the gut, and I could see the fear reflected in Eric's eyes. He shifted the car into drive, his hands shaking as he pressed down on the accelerator. The SUV lurched forward, the headlights barely cutting through the fog, but we were moving again. We had to keep going. The fog was so thick, it was like driving through a cloud. I could barely see the road in front of us. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I kept sneaking glances at the hitchhiker. He seemed unnaturally calm, as if he knew something we didn't. Carrie was gripping her seat, her knuckles white. We need to get off this road, she whispered, but there was nowhere to turn. We're going in circles, Jason muttered from the back seat, his voice tight with fear. This is insane. He was right. We'd passed the same broken down sign for the 4th time now, but the road just kept twisting and turning, leading us deeper into the fog. Eric's face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. What the hell is happening? He whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine's hum. We're trapped, I muttered, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. We're trapped on this road. The hitchhiker's cold eyes met mine in the rearview mirror. It's not the road that's trapping you, he said quietly. It's you. You chose this path. His words echoed in my mind. But before I could respond, the car jerked violently to the side. Eric swore, struggling to regain control. The car skidded to a stop, and for a moment, everything was silent. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and our ragged breathing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear settling deep in my bones. Eric let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "What the hell was that?" Carrie asked, her voice trembling. None of us had an answer. The fog was so thick, we couldn't see more than a few feet in front of us. Eric tried to start the car again, but it wouldn't move. "It's stuck," he muttered, his voice filled with frustration. He slammed his fist on the dashboard. "This is insane." The hitchhiker sat back, a small smile playing on his lips. "You're not going anywhere," he said softly. "Not until the road takes what it's owed." "What the hell are you talking about?" Jason snapped, his patience wearing thin. "What does the road want?" The hitchhiker's smile faded, his expression serious. "One of you has to stay," he said simply. "That's the price. The road always takes someone." His words sent a chill down my spine. One of us had to stay. It sounded insane, but the way he said it made it feel terrifyingly real. We sat in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just a creepy story. This was real. The road wanted one of us, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Eric let out a harsh laugh, his voice shaky. "This is insane," he muttered. "We're not playing this game. We're all getting out of here." But deep down, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Jason leaned forward, his voice tight with frustration. "If this road is so dangerous, why are you still here?" he demanded. "Why hasn't it taken you?" The hitchhiker's smile returned, cold and unsettling. "Who says it hasn't?" he asked softly. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just some random guy. He'd been here before. He wasn't looking for a ride. He was looking for someone to take his place. The horror of what he was saying sank in. He wasn't just here by chance. He had been waiting for us. Jason's eyes widened as the realization dawned on him too. "You're not leaving, are you?" I asked quietly, my voice trembling. The hitchhiker didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't planning to leave. He was here to stay. Suddenly, Jason lunged for the door, yanking it open and stumbling out into the fog. "I'm not doing this," he shouted, his voice echoing in the mist. "I'm not staying here. Jason, wait." I scrambled to unbuckle my seatbelt and follow him. But it was too late. The fog swallowed him whole, and within seconds, he was gone. I stood frozen, my heart pounding as the reality of our situation set in. "Jason," I yelled into the thick fog, but there was no response. The silence was suffocating. It was as though the fog had consumed him. Eric joined me outside the car, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to go after him. He can't survive out there alone." But before we could move, the hitchhiker spoke from inside the car, his voice calm and detached. "He's already gone," he said. "Shut up," Eric snapped, his voice cracking. "Just shut up." Carrie stepped out of the car, wrapping her arms around herself. "We can't leave him out there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to try." I exchanged a glance with Eric. As much as we wanted to run after Jason, we had no idea where to start. The fog was thick, disorienting, and the thought of leaving him behind was unbearable. "We're going," I said firmly, grabbing a flashlight from the back of the SUV. "We can't just abandon him." I flicked on the light, the beam cutting a narrow path through the fog. Eric grabbed another flashlight, and together we plunged into the mist, leaving Carrie with the hitchhiker. The sound of our footsteps was muffled, and the deeper we went, the more surreal everything felt. The fog was so thick it felt like walking through a dream, a nightmare. Trees loomed in the distance, their branches like skeletal hands. The air was cold, damp, and unnaturally still. My breath came in short bursts, and I could hear Eric muttering under his breath behind me. "Jason." I called out again, but my voice was swallowed by the fog, disappearing into the void. The further we walked, the more unsettling everything became. The road beneath our feet felt strange, softer than asphalt should be, almost pliable, like we were walking on something alive. I tried not to think about it, focusing on finding Jason, but the hitchhiker's words echoed in my mind. The road took him. After what felt like hours, Eric stopped, panting, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "This is pointless," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's gone. The fog, it swallowed him." I wanted to argue, to push forward, but deep down, I knew he was right. Jason was gone. Whether the fog, the road, or something else had taken him, I didn't know. But we weren't going to find him by wandering aimlessly. "Let's head back," I muttered, turning my flashlight toward the car. Maybe he'll find his way back to the car." Eric nodded, his face pale, eyes distant. We retraced our steps in silence, the fog pressing in around us like a suffocating blanket. The air felt heavier with each step, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just beyond the beam of the flashlight. When we made it back to the car, Carrie was pacing nervously. She ran over to us as soon as she saw our flashlights. "Did you find him?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head. "The fog, it's too thick. We couldn't see anything." Her face crumpled, and she leaned against the car, tears welling in her eyes. Eric slammed his fist against the hood, a frustrated scream tearing from his throat. "That bastard," he muttered, glaring at the hitchhiker. "You knew this would happen. You knew." The hitchhiker just shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I told you. One of you has to stay." Carrie looked up, her eyes full of fear. "Jason, he's not coming back, is he?" The hitchhiker's voice was cold. "No, he's gone. The road took him because it needed someone. That's the deal." Eric lunged at him, grabbing the hitchhiker by the collar of his coat. "You son of a bitch. You planned this. You brought us here too." "I didn't bring you here," the hitchhiker said, eerily calm. "You came on your own. Once you're on this road, there's no going back. One of you has to stay. The road always takes someone." Eric shoved him away, his hands trembling with rage and frustration. "We're getting out of here. All of us. You hear me?" Eric's voice cracked with fear, but his words were full of defiance. The hitchhiker smiled that thin, cold smile again. "No, you won't," he said. We stood there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Jason was gone. The hitchhiker's words echoed in my mind. "One of you has to stay." Carrie wiped her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't stay here. We have to leave. Now." Eric nodded, his face pale, his hands shaking. "Yeah, let's go." We piled back into the SUV, the atmosphere heavy with fear and uncertainty. The hitchhiker sat in the back, silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. No one spoke as Eric started the car and began driving again, the headlights barely cutting through the fog. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd be able to leave. That we could get off this cursed road and put everything behind us. But then the hitchhiker leaned forward, his voice low, full of grim certainty. "The road isn't done with you yet." I turned to him, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" He smiled, his eyes gleaming with that same unsettling calm. "The road always takes what it's owed." "Jason wasn't enough," he continued, his voice soft but chilling. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced at Eric and Carrie. They both looked terrified, just as I felt. "We're getting out of here," Eric muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter, his voice shaking. "We're not going to be your next victims." The hitchhiker didn't respond, but his silence was more ominous than anything he could have said. As we drove, I noticed something strange. The fog seemed to be lifting. the trees growing thinner as the road straightened out. For the first time in hours, I saw the faint glow of lights in the distance, a sign that we were nearing civilization. "We're almost there," I whispered, relief washing over me. But the hitchhiker's words echoed in my mind. "One of you has to stay." The lights grew brighter, and for a fleeting moment, I believed we'd made it, that we were going to escape. But then, without warning, the car jerked violently to the side. The tires screeched as Eric lost control of the wheel. We spun out of control, the world blurring around us as the SUV skidded off the road and slammed into something solid. Everything went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the cold, damp ground, the fog swirling around me like a living thing. My head throbbed, and my body ached, but I was alive. Slowly, I sat up, blinking through the haze as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The SUV was wrecked, its front end crumpled against a tree. Eric was slumped over the wheel, unconscious, but breathing. Carrie was lying a few feet away, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. But she was alive too. I staggered to my feet, my mind racing. Where had the hitchhiker gone? Had he left us here to die? Or had the road taken him to us? I stumbled over to check on Carrie. A noise caught my attention, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very ground beneath my feet. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the fog began to swirl faster, thickening once again. And then I saw it. Something moving in the mist, something dark and massive, like a shadow come to life. It moved with purpose, with hunger, and it was coming straight for us. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The fog pressed in closer, suffocating, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the hitchhiker had been right all along. The road wasn't done with us yet, and as the shadow closed in, I realized that no matter how far we drove, no matter how fast we ran, there was no escaping this place. One of us had to stay. As the shadow loomed closer, I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven ground. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, and the realization that there was no way out hit me like a freight train. The road wanted one of us. Jason was already gone, swallowed by the mist. But somehow, it wasn't enough. The road was still hungry, still waiting to take more. I forced myself to look at Carrie. Her leg was badly broken, and she was drifting in and out of consciousness, her face pale from the pain. Eric was still slumped over the wheel, blood trickling down his forehead from the impact. He looked as though he hadn't moved at all since the crash. My mind was racing, every instinct screaming at me to do something, to save them, to get us out of this nightmare. But deep down, I knew what the hitchhiker had meant. The road always takes what it's owed, and it wasn't just after Jason. It wanted all of us. Suddenly, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. The hitchhiker hadn't just been a passenger. He was part of this, a pawn of the road, guiding us toward this moment. He had been here before, countless times. He was looking for replacements, for someone to take his place. And we had walked right into the trap. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I knew then what I had to do. If I didn't make a choice, the road would take us all. But maybe, just maybe, I could save them. I turned away from the wreckage, my legs shaking as I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. The shadow was still there, waiting, watching, but it didn't move. It was waiting for me to make the choice. "I'll stay," I whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the fog swirling around me. The shadow paused, looming over me. For a moment, everything was still, as though the road itself was listening, considering my offer. Then, slowly, the fog began to thin, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. I glanced back at Carrie and Eric, lying there, helpless, and I knew that they would be all right. The road had accepted my offer, but as the fog started to dissipate, something strange happened. The shadow that had been looming over me shifted, its form dissolving into the mist. And then, out of the fog, the hitchhiker appeared once more. He stood there, just a few feet away, his expression calm and emotionless. But there was something different about him now. Something unsettling. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now gleamed with something else entirely. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The hitchhiker smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "Because the road never lets anyone leave," he said softly. "Not really." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "You thought you could sacrifice yourself to save them," he said, his voice dripping with pity. "But the road doesn't care about your sacrifice. It never did." A cold chill crept up my spine as his words sank in. "The road doesn't want just one of you," he continued, his voice growing darker. "It wants all of you. And no matter what you do, it will take you, one by one." I stared at him, the weight of his words crashing down on me like a tidal wave. The hitchhiker had never been looking for a replacement. He had been leading us here all along, knowing that no matter what choices we made, the road would claim us eventually. And then, as if to drive the point home, the hitchhiker's form began to dissolve once more, merging with the fog until he was gone, disappearing into the mist like a ghost. I stood there, trembling, my mind racing. There was no escape. The road had taken Jason, and soon it would take Eric, Carrie, and me. But as I stood there, the fog slowly lifting, I realized something else. The hitchhiker wasn't just part of the road. He was the road, an extension of its will, a puppet controlled by something far greater and more malevolent than any of us could understand. Our fate was sealed. We were never leaving this place. Not alive, anyway. But maybe, just maybe, the road wasn't done with me yet. Just as I was about to turn back toward Eric and Carrie, I heard a faint sound in the distance, the unmistakable rumble of an engine approaching from the highway. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Could it be? Help? The sound grew louder, closer. Before I knew it, headlights pierced through the thinning fog. A car, an old beat-up sedan, pulled up alongside the wreckage. The driver's window rolled down, and a man leaned out, his face obscured by a faded baseball cap. "You folks need a ride?" My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the man. His face was weathered, his clothes worn and dirty, but something about him seemed familiar. "We had an accident," I stammered, my voice barely audible. "We need help." The man's eyes flicked toward the wrecked SUV, then back to me. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "Hop in," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'll take you where you need to go." And in that moment, I knew with chilling certainty who he was. The road had come for us once again. This time, there was no escaping. I looked back at Eric and Carrie, lying helplessly by the wrecked car. I knew the truth now. The road had taken Jason, and soon, it would take us all. There was no running from it. It was inevitable. As I stood frozen, the fog slowly closed in once more, and the rumble of the engine faded into the night, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Next story. My mornings began with a consistency that felt almost sacred. The alarm clock, a monotonous drone, jolted me awake at 6:30 sharp. The same sound every day, like an artificial bird call breaking the calm of my slumber. I never hit snooze. There was no need for it. My life was a well-tuned machine. Wake, shower, eat, drive to work. A series of rituals, done without thought or variation. I lived alone in a small apartment, nothing remarkable, but enough for someone like me. Plain white walls, a couple of framed posters, a television that was more of a background hum than a real source of entertainment. My job at the office was the same, repetitive, comfortable. and numbing in a way that allowed me to avoid thinking too deeply about anything beyond the routine. There were small hints, looking back, that all was not as it should be. The constant, nagging sensation that something was off, like a faint buzzing just at the edge of hearing. But I ignored it. I had no reason not to. Nothing in my life was out of place, or at least, nothing that couldn't be explained by the regular wear and tear of existence. It started with the dreams. At first, they were just fragments. In the dreams, I walked alone in a fog-drenched landscape, my feet sinking into the wet earth with every step. I could hear something following me, the crack of branches underfoot, a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Always nothing. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, but it was easy to shake off. Everyone had bad dreams now and then, right? But they kept coming, night after night, growing longer, more detailed, and each morning I woke up feeling more drained, more disconnected from the world. It was like I was slowly being unraveled, one dream at a time. Still, I didn't talk about it. I went to work, made small talk with my coworkers, laughed when it was appropriate, kept my head down when it wasn't. I told myself it was just stress, working too much. There was a creeping sense of dread I couldn't shake, a feeling of being watched. The first real sign came on a Monday, a day like any other, except it wasn't. I woke up to the sound of my alarm, same as always, but the moment I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the room itself was closing in on me. I got up, went through the motions. Everything felt off, like I was moving through molasses, sluggish and disoriented. The feeling stuck with me the whole morning, gnawing at the back of my mind. By the time I got to the office, it was almost unbearable. The fluorescent lights above seemed too bright, and the hum of conversation around me grated against my nerves. I sat down at my desk and tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting. It was like I was waiting for something to happen, though I had no idea what. I managed to make it through most of the day without incident, but just as I was getting ready to leave, something caught my eye. A note, sitting on my desk, neatly folded in half. I hadn't noticed it before. There was no name, no address, just my name written in neat, looping letters. I opened it. "You're not alone." I stared at the note, heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to laugh it off. A prank, maybe. Someone in the office messing with me. But there was something about the handwriting, something unsettling in the way the letters seemed too perfect, too deliberate. I crumpled the note in my hand and tossed it in the trash. It was nothing, I told myself. A stupid joke. But the unease clung to me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I went home that night, locked the door behind me, and tried to forget about it. The dreams were worse that night. I was back in the fog, the ground sucking at my feet as I stumbled forward, trying to escape something I couldn't see. The growling was louder now, closer. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, the warmth of it sending shivers down my spine. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew it would be the last thing I ever saw. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I sat up in bed, trying to calm myself down, but the room felt wrong. The shadows seemed to move, shifting in the corners of my vision. I turned on the light, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But of course, there was no one. I barely slept after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it. The presence. It was there, lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to let my guard down. I went to work the next day in a daze, my mind foggy from lack of sleep. The office felt different, colder. Somehow, my coworkers seemed distant, their faces blurred and unfamiliar. I tried to focus on my tasks. The note from the day before kept creeping back into my thoughts. By lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the break room, hoping a cup of coffee would clear my head. As I reached for the pot, I noticed something odd. There was another note, this time taped to the machine. "It's watching you." I nearly dropped the cup. My hands were shaking, my pulse racing. I looked around, but the break room was empty. My skin prickled with a sense of foreboding, as if I was being watched, though no one was there. I ripped the note off the machine and shoved it into my pocket, my mind racing. Who was doing this? Why me? I had no enemies, no one in the office who would go to such lengths to mess with me. But the notes, the dreams, they were connected. They had to be. I felt it in my gut, that deep, primal fear. Over the next few days, the notes kept appearing. In my apartment, slipped under my door. At the office, tucked into my files. At first, they were vague, cryptic messages about being watched, being followed. But as time went on, they became more direct, more personal. It knows your secrets. There's no escape. I started seeing things. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch glimpses of movement. Shadows that didn't belong. At night, I could hear footsteps outside my door, soft and deliberate, as though someone was pacing back and forth, waiting for the right moment to strike. I barely slept. I stopped going out, stopped talking to people. My life became a series of routines designed to keep the fear at bay, but it wasn't working. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. The presence was everywhere, suffocating me with its invisible weight. And then, one night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A soft creak, like the sound of someone stepping on a loose floorboard. My heart froze. I strained my ears, listening for any other sounds, but there was nothing. Just silence. I told myself it was my imagination, but then I heard it again. Louder this time, closer. I sat up, my body rigid with fear. The room was dark, but I could just make out the faint outline of my door. It was closed, but there was a thin strip of light visible underneath, casting a faint glow across the floor. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, moving toward my door. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at the light, waiting, terrified. The door handle rattled. I jumped out of bed, backing away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The handle rattled again, harder this time, as if someone was trying to force it open. I could hear the low, guttural sound of breathing from the other side. My mind raced, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. But there was no explanation, no logic to cling to. Just raw, unrelenting fear. The door creaked open. I didn't think I couldn't. I bolted for the window, fumbling with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. The breathing behind me grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A figure, tall, shadowed, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes, they were burning bright and hungry, like twin embers in the night. I managed to throw open the window and climbed out without a second thought, nearly tripping over the sill in my panic. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, but it wasn't enough to clear my head. All I could think about was getting away from that thing inside my apartment, away from the burning eyes and the sound of its breath scraping the walls of my mind. I tumbled down the fire escape. My feet slipped on the rusted metal steps, but I kept going, my hands gripping the cold railing as I half climbed, half fell to the street below. I was barefoot, still in my sweat-drenched clothes from bed, but none of that mattered. My mind was filled with a single, pulsing command: run. When my feet hit the ground, I bolted down the alley, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't stop to think where I was going. My apartment was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, a kind of place where people only left their homes when absolutely necessary. The streets were deserted, as they always were, this late at night. But somehow, that made it worse. There was no one to call for help, no one to notice if I disappeared into the shadows. I sprinted through the darkened streets, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, the sound of footsteps echoed. They were heavy and unhurried, as if whatever was following me knew I had nowhere to go. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could see the faint silhouette of the figure, moving steadily, relentlessly, closing the distance between us with every passing second. I didn't know what I expected to find. Some kind of refuge, maybe, or a safe place where I could hide until it went away. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no such place. Not anymore. My breath came in ragged gasps as I rounded the corner, my eyes darting wildly for any sign of life. A gas station flickered at the end of the block, its neon lights casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. Without thinking, I dashed toward it, my feet slapping against the concrete, the chill of the night air biting into my skin. I reached the door and yanked it open. The bell above jingled like a sick parody of a welcome. The fluorescent lights inside were too bright, too sterile, making everything feel unreal. For a brief moment, I thought I'd lost it. Maybe whatever had been chasing me had stayed behind in the dark, unable to cross into this harshly lit sanctuary. But then I saw the cashier. He was standing behind the counter, staring at me with wide, glassy eyes, his mouth slightly open. He looked as if he had been caught mid-sentence. His hand was frozen in place, hovering above the register, and I realized with a jolt that he wasn't moving, not blinking, not breathing, nothing. It was like time had stopped for him. I stumbled back, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could even begin to process it, I heard the door creak behind me. I turned, slowly, my stomach twisting with dread. The figure was standing in the doorway, its outline blurred by the harsh fluorescent light. But those eyes, those burning, searing eyes, they were clearer than ever, locked onto me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I didn't wait. I couldn't. I tore through the gas station, knocking over displays as I ran toward the back. My only thought was to find a way out, any way out. I pushed through a door marked employees only. I hoped it would lead to a back exit, but all I found was a narrow storage room, filled with shelves of cleaning supplies and old boxes, a dead end. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I pressed myself against the far wall, my breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. And then, in that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, something clicked in my mind. The dreams. The endless nights spent wandering through that fog-drenched landscape. Always running, always being chased, but never knowing by what. The notes, the warnings, the sense that I was being watched. It was all connected. Somehow, this thing, whatever it was, had been with me from the beginning, waiting, watching, hunting, and now it had found me. The door creaked open, and the figure stepped into the room, its shadow stretching across the floor. I pressed myself harder against the wall, my hands trembling, my heart racing. My mind screamed at me to fight, to do something, anything to stop it, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure took another step toward me, its eyes glowing with a sickening light. For a moment, I thought this was it, that I was going to die here, in this tiny, forgotten room, at the hands of something incomprehensible. But then it stopped. It stood there, just a few feet away, staring at me with those terrible eyes. And then, without a word, it raised its hand. I braced myself for the end, but instead, it reached into its pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. Slowly, deliberately, it unfolded it and held it out to me. I stared at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting, the paper held out like an offering. With shaking hands, I reached out and took it. I unfolded the note, my breath hitching in my throat as I read the words scrawled across the page. "You're not who you think you are." The words on the paper blurred in my vision, my mind struggling to grasp their meaning. I'm not who I think I am. What did that even mean? I looked up at the figure. but it was already gone, vanished into the shadows as though it had never been there. For a long time, I just stood there, the note clenched in my hand, my thoughts racing. The figure, the notes, the dreams, none of it made any sense. And yet, at the same time, it felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't even know I was trying to solve, had just clicked into place. I wasn't who I thought I was, but who was I? The rest of that night passed in a blur. I don't remember leaving the gas station, don't remember how I got back to my apartment. The next thing I knew, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the note crumpled in my hand. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind was too full of questions, of doubts. What had the figure meant? Was this some kind of twisted game, a way to mess with my head? Or was it the truth? For the next few days, I went through the motions of my life like a ghost. I went to work. I ate. I tried to pretend that everything was normal, but nothing was normal anymore. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me, like a burden I couldn't escape. The dreams continued, but they were different now. I wasn't just running anymore. I was searching for something I couldn't quite name, and every time I woke up, I had the same feeling, that I was getting closer to whatever it was I needed to find. And then, one night, I woke up with the answer. It was so simple, I almost laughed. All this time, I had been searching for something outside myself, something that could explain the strange events that had been happening to me. But the truth was, it had never been about the outside world. It was about me. I wasn't who I thought I was because I didn't know who I was. The figure, the notes, the dreams, they all led here. They had been guiding me to this realization, that my life, my identity, was nothing more than a fragile construct, something I had built to protect myself from the truth. But the truth was out now, and there was no going back. It was in the early hours of the morning when I decided to confront it. The presence that had been haunting me, the thing that had been watching me all this time. I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew what I had to do. I sat up in bed, the room bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights outside. The air felt thick with anticipation, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my move. I got up and walked to the mirror, my reflection staring back at me with the same tired, haunted eyes I had seen for weeks. But this time, there was something different, a sense of clarity, of purpose. I wasn't who I thought I was. I looked at my reflection, really looked at it for the first time in what felt like forever. The person staring back at me wasn't a stranger, but they weren't me either. Not the person I had spent my whole life pretending to be. "I know who you are," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. And then, as if in response, the reflection smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculating, the kind of smile that sent a chill down my spine. My heart began to race as I watched my own reflection move, in a way I hadn't. It tilted its head to the side, eyes narrowing in what could only be described as mockery. The reflection's lips curled upward, as though it had been waiting for this moment, savoring it. "What are you?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. My mouth was dry, my body frozen in place, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. I knew I was staring at myself, or at least, I should have been. But there was something distinctly wrong about the person looking back at me. It wasn't me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't looking at my reflection. I was looking at something else, something that had taken my shape. Something that had been following me, manipulating me, pulling the strings behind the scenes, and now, it was showing itself. The figure in the mirror raised a hand, my hand, and waved, a slow, deliberate gesture that sent a surge of panic through me. My own body refused to move, locked in place, as though some invisible force had taken control. I tried to speak, tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my chest constricted. Then the reflection spoke. "You're not who you think you are." The voice was mine, but the tone was wrong. It was distorted, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. Too slow, too deliberate. Each word dripped with malice, with a dark understanding that I couldn't comprehend. I stared at the reflection, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This had to be a dream, a nightmare brought on by the weeks of stress, the sleepless nights, the paranoia. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too real. The figure in the mirror leaned closer, its eyes locking onto mine. "You've felt it, haven't you? The disconnect, the gaps in your memory, the way the world feels wrong." I blinked, a flood of memories rushing back all at once. The strange notes, the dreams, the way people around me seemed to freeze in time, like the cashier at the gas station. The way I sometimes couldn't remember entire chunks of my day. The way my reflection in the mirror had sometimes looked just a little too different, a little too aware. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure, my reflection, grinned wider. "You've been living a lie, trapped in a loop of your own making. Every day, you wake up, thinking this is your life, thinking you're in control. But you're not. You never have been." I felt my pulse quicken as its words sank in. A loop, a lie. The words didn't make sense, and yet they struck something deep within me. Something I had tried to ignore, to bury. All those days that felt the same, the nagging feeling that I was reliving the same moments over and over again, but with slight differences, subtle shifts in my routine, my settings. The reflection in the mirror seemed to sense my growing understanding, and its grin widened further, stretching unnaturally across its face. "Do you remember the first time you died?" My heart skipped a beat. Died. What was it talking about? "You've died before," it continued, as though reading my mind. "You die every day. You just don't remember it." I took a step back from the mirror, my mind spinning. This wasn't possible. I wasn't dead. I wasn't trapped in some kind of time loop. But even as I tried to deny it, memories began to surface. Vague, disjointed flashes of moments I couldn't place. Moments that ended in terror, in pain. I had died before. The memory hit me like a freight train. I remembered standing on the edge of a building, staring down at the street below, feeling the cold wind whip against my skin. I remembered the way my stomach had dropped as I stepped forward, the sensation of falling, the crushing impact as my body hit the ground, and then, nothing. But that was just one memory. There were others. So many others. Being chased down dark alleys, hunted by faceless figures, torn apart by unseen forces. Each time, I died. Each time, I woke up the next day, as if nothing had happened. As if the day had simply reset. How? How is this possible? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide from the truth that was closing in on me. The reflection tilted its head again, watching me with those dark, knowing eyes. "Because this is the life you chose. This is the punishment you brought upon yourself." Punishment? For what? The figure's grin faltered, just for a moment. A flicker of something, maybe anger, passed through its eyes. "You don't remember. Of course you don't. That's part of the punishment." My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments. The cryptic words the reflection was throwing at me didn't make sense. None of it fit together in a way that I could understand. The figure took a step closer to the mirror, its face now only inches away from mine. I could see every detail of it now, the same features as mine, but twisted, distorted, and those eyes. They weren't mine. They were filled with something darker, something alien. "This isn't your first life," it said. Its voice was low and venomous. "You've lived countless lives, made countless choices, and every time, you made the wrong one." I shook my head, my hands clenching into fists. "What choices? What are you talking about?" The reflection leaned in even closer, its breath fogging the glass between us. You killed someone. You've killed many people. And now, you're trapped in this loop, reliving your death over and over again. Until you understand. Until you atone. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This couldn't be true. It wasn't possible. I wasn't a murderer. I wasn't some kind of monster. But deep down, something inside me stirred. A memory, a face, twisted in pain, eyes wide with terror. The reflection watched me, waiting for the realization to sink in. I stumbled back from the mirror, my chest heaving with panic. No, that's not possible. I wouldn't. You did, the reflection interrupted, its voice harsh and unyielding. You killed, and this is your punishment. To live, to die, to repeat it all, until you understand, until you remember. I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, the walls closing in around me. I turned away from the mirror, clutching my head, trying to make sense of the flood of images, of memories. Memories that didn't belong to me, but they did. They did belong to me. A face flashed in my mind again, this time clearer. A woman, someone I had known, someone I had cared about, and then the moment I had ended her life. Cold, calculated, no hesitation. I collapsed to my knees, my stomach churning with revulsion, with guilt. The memories were flooding back now, and there was no stopping them. All the lives I had taken, all the choices I had made, I could see them all, laid out before me like a path of destruction. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the flood of memories stopped. I knelt there on the floor, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. I had killed. I had lived countless lives. I had died countless deaths. And now, I was trapped in this endless loop of punishment. Forced to relive my death over and over, until I could atone for my sins. But how could I atone? How could I fix something that had already been done, that had already left so many lives destroyed in its wake? I stood up on shaky legs, staring at my reflection in the mirror. It wasn't smiling anymore. It was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. You can end this, it said softly, almost gentle. You can end the loop. You just have to make the right choice. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. What choice? The reflection's eyes locked onto mine. You already know. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at my own reflection, at the figure that had haunted me for so long. The truth was laid bare before me now, undeniable and inescapable. I had created this loop. I had brought this upon myself. And there was only one way to end it. The choice I had to make, the right choice, was the one I had avoided in all my previous lives. In every cycle, I had tried to run, to escape the consequences of my actions. I had sought a way out, a way to break free from the punishment without facing the truth. But there was no running anymore. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of my guilt, my sins, pressed down on me, but I forced myself to stand tall. I had to do this. I had to make the right choice. I reached out toward the mirror, my fingers trembling as they made contact with the cold glass. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, slowly, the surface of the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The reflection smiled again, but this time, it was different. There was no malice, no mockery, just acceptance. You know what you have to do, it said softly. It's time. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. I knew what had to be done. The only way to break the loop was to confront the truth, to accept responsibility for my actions, and to face the consequences, no matter how painful they might be. With one last, deep breath, I pushed my hand through the surface of the mirror. The glass gave way like liquid, enveloping my arm, then my body, until I was completely submerged in its cold, reflective depths. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was standing on the edge of a familiar rooftop. The wind whipped through my hair, and below me, the city stretched out in every direction, bathed in the soft glow of street lights. I knew this place. I had been here before. Many times. This was the place where I had ended my life in one of my previous cycles. The place where I had thought I could escape the loop by taking the ultimate way out. But now, I knew better. I wasn't here to jump. I was here to face the truth. The woman, the one I had killed, stood before me, her eyes filled with sorrow, with pain. But there was no anger, no hatred, only sadness. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. She nodded, her expression softening. "I know." I took a step toward her, my heart heavy with guilt. I don't know how to fix this." She smiled, a sad, bittersweet smile. "You already have." And then, just like that, she was gone. I stood there, alone on the rooftop, the weight of my past lifting off my shoulders for the first time in what felt like eternity. The loop was broken. The punishment was over. I had finally made the right choice. Next story. In my hometown of Flagstaff, Arizona, the biggest excitement for a kid my age was the occasional swap meet or rummage sale. It was a quiet place, with pine-covered mountains watching over us and streets lined with small, unremarkable houses. There was nothing out of the ordinary about the place or the people who lived there. My parents, in their late 40s, still looked at life with the dull complacency. I was the only child, caught between childhood and the endless monotony of adulthood that stretched out before me. I was 14, and I liked comic books. Not in the obsessive way some of my friends did, with walls plastered in posters of caped crusaders, or shelves groaning with action figures. I enjoyed the escape, the way a good comic could pull me out of my ordinary life and transport me somewhere else. My collection was modest. A few superhero stories, some darker graphic novels, and a lot of cheap vintage ones I'd picked up at flea markets over the years. My dad was the one who introduced me to flea markets. He liked to think of himself as a treasure hunter, always convinced the next trip would yield some rare find that would change our lives forever. Mostly he just brought home more clutter, rusty old tools, faded postcards, broken watches. I didn't mind tagging along, though. It gave me an excuse to rummage through boxes of old books and comics, searching for something unique to add to my collection. One Saturday morning, we drove out to a market just outside town, a place we hadn't been to before. It was smaller than most, a handful of vendors set up in a dusty lot, their tables piled high with everything from chipped dishes to out-of-date electronics. I wandered off from my dad almost immediately. I headed toward the rows of books and magazines. There was nothing interesting at first, just the usual dog-eared paperbacks and moldy old romance novels. And then I saw it. It was tucked between two other comics, its cover faded and brittle, as if it had been forgotten for decades. The title was scrawled in jagged black letters, "The Ink That Kills." The artwork was crude, showing a group of children huddled together in fear, a dark figure looming behind them. There was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't like the other comics I'd seen. It felt wrong. I picked it up, flipping through the pages carefully. The artwork inside was just as crude as the cover. The story, following a group of kids who found a strange comic book. This comic book, in fact, that seemed to have a life of its own. The further they got into the story, the more the events in the comic mirrored their real lives. And then, one by one, the kids started disappearing. I glanced up at the vendor, an old man sitting behind the table, watching me with tired, sunken eyes. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly when I held the comic out to him. I don't remember how much I paid for it, $1, maybe $2. It didn't matter. I shoved it into my backpack, feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. That night, after dinner, I retreated to my room, eager to read the comic in peace. My room was my sanctuary, the only place where I could be alone with my thoughts. free from the quiet demands of my parents and the dullness of small-town life. I threw my backpack on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and lay down on my bed, pulling the comic out of its wrinkled paper bag. I flipped open the cover, my fingers brushing against the brittle pages. The artwork was even worse up close, the lines jagged and uneven, as if they'd been drawn in a hurry. But the story hooked me. The kids in the comic found the book in a dusty old shop, much like the one I'd been to earlier that day. As they read it, strange things began happening in their lives, events that mirrored the story they were reading. One of them saw a shadowy figure outside his window at night. Another heard whispers coming from the pages of the book. And then, they started disappearing. First one, then another, until only one boy was left. The last page was unfinished. The final panel, blank. I frowned, flipping back through the pages, searching for some kind of resolution. But there wasn't one. The story just ended. I closed the comic, feeling a chill creep up my spine. It was just a story, I reminded myself. Just an old, poorly drawn comic, but something didn't feel right. The first strange thing happened the next day at school. I was sitting in math class, bored out of my mind, doodling in the margins of my notebook. I wasn't much of an artist, but I liked to draw little shapes and patterns when I was bored. Triangles, circles, spirals, harmless stuff. But when I glanced down at my notebook that day, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't the usual doodles I'd been drawing. It was a figure, tall, thin, with long, twisted limbs and a featureless face. It was standing in the corner of the page, watching me. I blinked, my pulse quickening. I didn't remember drawing it. In fact, I was certain I hadn't, but there it was, staring back at me from the paper. My hand shook slightly as I ripped the page out of my notebook and crumpled it up, stuffing it into my backpack. My teacher shot me a glance, but I ignored it, my mind racing. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the comic. I hadn't touched it since I finished reading it. But now it seemed to be lurking in the back of my mind, a constant, nagging presence. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart thudding in my chest. The house was quiet, the only sound, the faint creak of the floorboards, as the house settled. I rolled over, glancing toward my backpack where the comic was tucked away. A part of me wanted to throw it out, to get rid of it before something else happened. But another part of me, the part that couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business, needed to know more. I had to know how the story ended. The next day, something even stranger happened. I was in the hallway between classes when I saw him. One of the kids from my math class, a quiet boy named Daniel. He was walking ahead of me, his head down, his backpack slung over one shoulder. There was nothing unusual about him, except for the shadow. It was faint, barely visible in the fluorescent lights of the hallway, but there was something wrong with it. It didn't match Daniel's movements. It was taller, thinner, its arms too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my ears. Daniel didn't seem to notice anything. He just kept walking, disappearing into the crowd of students. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where he'd been, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It couldn't have been real. It had to be my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to focus on school, on my friends, on anything but the comic and the strange things that seemed to be happening around me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. I started seeing the figure everywhere, in the shadows of the trees as I walked home from school, in the reflections of the windows at night. Even in the corner of my vision, when I wasn't paying attention, I stopped drawing altogether. I couldn't bring myself to pick up a pencil, not after what had happened in math class. Every time I saw a blank page, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. It was like the figure was just waiting for me to slip, to draw it again. Then Daniel disappeared. It happened on a Wednesday. 1 minute, he was sitting in math class, quiet, as always. The next, he was gone. No one knew where he'd gone, and the police had no leads. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow I'd seen that day in the hallway. I knew it was connected. I didn't know how, but I knew. That night, I pulled the comic out of my backpack again, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages. There, in one of the panels, was a boy who looked exactly like Daniel. Same clothes, same backpack, and behind him, the figure loomed, its long twisted arms reaching out. I slammed the comic shut, my heart racing. It was real. The comic was real, and it was happening. The kids in the story were disappearing, just like Daniel, and I knew I was next. The air in my room felt heavier as I sat there, staring at the closed comic book. I couldn't breathe right, couldn't think straight. It didn't make any sense, but it was the only explanation. Somehow, the comic was tied to what was happening to the kids, Daniel, the others, and me. My mind raced, grasping at anything that could explain it rationally. But every time I thought I had an answer, it slipped through my fingers like sand. I couldn't just sit there and wait for it to happen to me. That was clear. I had to destroy it, burn it, tear it to pieces. Something without another thought. I grabbed the comic and bolted down the stairs, through the living room where my parents sat, watching TV, their eyes glued to the flickering screen. They didn't even glance up as I rushed past. My heart hammered in my chest. I burst out the back door and into the yard, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I stumbled to the fire pit we used for family barbecues, dropping to my knees in front of the cold ashes. The comic felt heavy in my hands, much heavier than a few pieces of paper should. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers trembling, but then I struck a match and tossed it into the pit. Flames flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the yard. I threw the comic into the fire and watched as the flames licked at the edges of the pages. For a moment, nothing happened. The paper curled and blackened, the ink bubbling and warping in the heat. Relief washed over me, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was over. I had destroyed it. But then, as the comic burned, I saw something in the flames. The shadowy figure, its blank face staring up at me from the pages, untouched by the fire. It didn't flicker or waver in the heat. It remained still and silent, watching me. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a stick from the ground and started poking at the ashes, trying to smother the flames, trying to destroy the image of the figure before it could do anything. But no matter how hard I tried, the figure remained. It seemed to grow stronger, the lines of its body more defined, its limbs stretching out across the charred pages. I backed away, my chest tight with fear. The flames died down, but the figure was still there, etched into the ashes, its arms outstretched, as if it was reaching for me. I turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind me. The image of the figure stayed burned into my mind for the rest of the night. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for me. Every shadow in my room seemed to shift and move. Every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me, just like it had come for the others. The next day at school, things felt different. The halls were quieter than usual, the usual chatter and laughter replaced by whispers. Everyone was talking about Daniel's disappearance. Some kids thought he'd run away. Others said he'd been kidnapped. But no one knew the truth. No one except me. I couldn't focus in class. My eyes kept drifting to the windows, expecting to see the shadowy figure standing there, watching me. But it never appeared. Not yet. During lunch, I overheard a conversation between two of my classmates. They were talking about another kid. Someone else who had gone missing last year. A kid named Jamie, who I vaguely remembered seeing in the halls, but never really knew. The rumor was that Jamie had vanished without a trace, just like Daniel. The pieces were falling into place. This had happened before. The comic wasn't just some random cursed object. It had a history, a pattern, and I was part of it now. When I got home that afternoon, I didn't go to my room. I couldn't bear to see the empty space where the comic had been. Instead, I went to the basement. My dad had a small workbench down there, cluttered with old tools and half-finished projects. I grabbed a hammer from the bench and stood there for a moment, staring at the floor. If burning the comic hadn't worked, maybe smashing it to pieces would. I couldn't take any chances. Whatever was happening, it was tied to the comic, and I had to stop it before it came for me. I went back out to the fire pit. The ashes were cold now, the remnants of the comic barely recognizable, but the figure was still there, faint but unmistakable. I gripped the hammer tightly in my hand and brought it down on the ashes, over and over again, pounding at the charred pages until they were nothing but dust. I stood there, panting, my heart racing in my chest. I had done it. I had destroyed the comic completely. There was no way it could come back now. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single page. One torn, blackened page, lying in the grass just outside the fire pit. I must have missed it when I was destroying the comic. My hands shook as I picked it up, turning it over. The figure was still there. The black figure stared back at me, its faceless head tilted ever so slightly, as if mocking my attempts to destroy it. I could almost feel its presence behind the image, a force more real than just ink on paper. My stomach twisted in knots. It had survived everything. Fire, destruction, and now even my last-ditch effort with the hammer. I realized that it was not bound by the comic itself, but by something else. The ink. That was it. The letter I had found inside the comic, the one that had warned me, had made it clear. It's not the comic that's cursed. It's the ink. Whoever holds the book becomes the next artist. Your drawings become real. You draw your own fate. I had been so focused on the comic, thinking that destroying the pages would save me. But it was more than that. The ink wasn't just in the comic. The ink had spread. My mind raced back to the drawings I had made in my notebook, the figure that had appeared there without my remembering it. The ink had already marked me. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as I stumbled back inside the house. I tore through my school bag, pulling out my notebooks and flipping through the pages. The figure was there, over and over again, sketched in the margins. Faint outlines barely noticeable, but undeniably present. I didn't even remember drawing most of them, but they were there. I had drawn it. I had made it real. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea how to stop it. I felt trapped, like the figure was closing in on me from every direction, no matter how hard I tried to fight it. The ink was in everything, in my drawings, in the very fabric of my life. I had unleashed it, and now it was coming for me. Desperation gnawed at me, tightening its grip. I couldn't go to my parents. They wouldn't understand, and I wasn't sure they'd believe me even if they did. I couldn't go to the police either. What would I tell them? That I was being haunted by a figure from a comic book. No one would believe me. I didn't believe it myself. There was only one thing left to do. I had to confront it. That night, I sat in my room, staring at a blank page in front of me. I had a pencil in my hand, the tip hovering just above the paper. The house was quiet, my parents already asleep, the air heavy with anticipation. I knew it was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the shadows that seemed to grow longer and darker as the night wore on. I had no idea how to defeat it, but I knew that the only way to end this was to face it head-on. The letter had said I was the artist now. I had drawn the figure into existence. Maybe, just maybe, I could draw it out of existence too. My hand shook as I pressed the pencil to the paper. I started drawing, my movements slow and deliberate, tracing the outline of the figure with careful precision. Its long arms, its thin, twisted body, its faceless head. Every detail etched into the page. just as I had seen it so many times before. But this time, I added something new. I drew chains. Thick, heavy chains that wrapped around the figure's arms and legs, binding it in place. I drew the chains tightening, pulling the figure down, forcing it to the ground. And then, I drew a cage, an impenetrable cage that trapped the figure inside, sealing it off from the world. I stared at the drawing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It was done. The figure was trapped. It couldn't escape. But even as I stared at the page, I knew it wasn't enough. The ink on the paper seemed to shift and writhe, the lines blurring and warping as if the figure was trying to break free. I could feel its presence, stronger than ever, pressing against the walls of my room, suffocating me with its dark, creeping energy. The drawing on the page wasn't enough to hold it. The ink had taken on a life of its own, no longer bound by the paper or my intentions. The figure was breaking through, pushing against the chains I had so carefully sketched, straining against the cage that was supposed to trap it. I needed more. The ink was not just a passive medium anymore. It was alive, twisting, moving, and feeding off the fear that had been growing inside me. The realization hit me hard. I had given it power. The more I tried to resist, the stronger it became. Every frantic attempt to erase or destroy it had only made it more real, more present. I had to do something drastic, something I hadn't yet considered. I grabbed my old art supplies from the bottom drawer of my desk. I hadn't touched them in years. The paint tubes were dried out and cracked, the brushes stiff with neglect. But the paints didn't matter now. What I needed was the charcoal, the thick, heavy black sticks that would let me overwrite the ink. If the ink was the source of the figure's power, then maybe, just maybe, I could drown it out with something else. Something darker, something more final. I pulled out a sheet of heavy sketch paper, laid it flat on the desk, and began to work. My hands shook as I gripped the charcoal. The thick black lines smudged under my fingers as I started drawing the figure again, this time bigger, bolder. I didn't stop at the outline. I pressed the charcoal deep into the paper, covering every inch of the figure in darkness. I erased the chains I had drawn earlier and instead surrounded the figure in black, heavy strokes that blurred the edges of its form. I made it a silhouette, a void, a thing made of pure shadow. I drew faster and faster, my heart pounding in my chest, the charcoal crumbling in my grip as I worked. Sweat dripped down my forehead, mixing with the smudges of black on my hands. The figure seemed to grow as I drew it, its limbs stretching and twisting, but I didn't let up. I filled the paper with darkness, making it impossible to tell where the figure ended and the background began. I was turning it into a black hole, a void that couldn't escape. Then I stopped. The drawing was complete. I stared at it, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The figure was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't standing over me, reaching out of the page like it had before. It was trapped, swallowed by the darkness I had created. I had given it nowhere to go. But there was one more step I had to take. I grabbed the lighter from my bedside drawer, the same one I had used earlier. My hands trembled as I flicked it on, the small flame flickering in the dim light of my room. I held the lighter over the drawing, watching the flames dance just inches from the charcoal-covered paper. For a moment, I hesitated. Could this really work? Could burning the drawing, erasing the figure one last time, be enough to finally rid me of it? The room felt still, almost too quiet, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The figure on the page seemed to shift slightly, the black lines warping ever so subtly. I felt its presence again, stronger than before, but contained. It was as if the figure knew what I was about to do, and it was fighting against it. I couldn't stop now. I had to finish it. With a quick flick of my wrist, I dropped the flame onto the corner of the drawing. The paper caught fire instantly, the flames licking across the edges. I watched, my heart racing, as the fire spread across the entire page, turning it into a swirling mass of ashen embers. For a split second, I thought I heard something, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there, just my dark, empty room. I turned back to the drawing, now almost entirely engulfed in flames. The last remnants of the figure disappeared into the fire, the charcoal turning to ash as the paper crumbled to dust. I stepped back, watching as the flames died down, leaving nothing but a pile of charred remnants on the floor. It was over. The figure was gone, or so I thought. For a few days, I allowed myself to believe that I had won. The oppressive feeling that had been following me for weeks seemed to lift, and for the first time in forever, I could breathe easily. I slept through the night without waking up, in a cold sweat, without seeing the figure lurking in the shadows. Life started to return to normal, but the fear never really went away. It lingered, just beneath the surface, like a splinter buried deep in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the figure was gone for good. I had destroyed the comic. I had burned the drawings. I had done everything I could. Yet something still didn't feel right. I stayed away from drawing. I avoided picking up a pencil, a pen, or anything that could leave marks on paper. It wasn't that I was scared of the figure coming back, not exactly, but every time I saw a blank page, I felt a tightness in my chest, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It was like the page was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the wrong move and bring it all back. Weeks went by. The police never found Daniel, and eventually, people stopped talking about it. His disappearance faded into the background, just another unsolved mystery in a town that liked to pretend bad things didn't happen. But I couldn't forget. I knew the truth, even if no one else did. One day, as I was cleaning out my room, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was going through an old pile of notebooks, tossing out the ones I didn't need anymore, when I found it. The crumpled page from my math class, the one I had ripped out and thrown into my backpack all those weeks ago. The figure was still there. My heart raced as I stared at the page, my fingers trembling. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. The same twisted, faceless figure I had drawn without even realizing it. The same figure that had haunted me, tormented me, tried to pull me into its world. I had missed it. In my rush to destroy everything, I had forgotten about this one page, but that wasn't the worst part. As I looked closer, I noticed something else, something that hadn't been there before. There were words, scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting at the bottom of the page. Words that I hadn't written. I'm still here. My breath caught in my throat. I dropped the page like it was burning me, stumbling back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure was still here. It hadn't gone away. It had never gone away. I backed out of my room, my mind spinning, my heart hammering in my chest. I thought I had beaten it. I thought I had destroyed it. But it was still here. And now, it was waiting. I don't know what to do anymore. The ink, the figure, the curse. Whatever it is, it's stronger than I realized. It's not just in the comic, or in the drawings. It's in me. It's in everything I touch, everything I create, and it's not going to stop. I tried to escape it. I tried to fight it. But the truth is, I'm part of it now. I'm the artist. And as long as I keep drawing, as long as I keep creating, the figure will never go away. So, I've made a decision. I won't draw anymore. I won't write, or doodle, or do anything that could bring it back. I can't risk it. I can't let it take me. But even as I sit here, writing this, putting my thoughts on paper, letting the words flow, I can feel it. It's still there, waiting, watching. The ink is spreading again, and I don't know how much longer I can hold it back. If you're reading this, I hope you understand. I hope you know what's coming. Because once you start drawing, once you put ink to paper, it never really goes away. And maybe, just maybe, you've already drawn it too. Next story. I had come to Briar Hollow under the guise of peace and quiet, perhaps to work on my book, or so I told myself. The truth was, a string of accidents in this forgotten town had piqued my interest. People had died in bizarre circumstances, and whispers had begun to circulate. They weren't accidents. The locals insisted that they were deaths caused by the cat. Ridiculous, I had thought at first. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized these weren't just coincidences. I couldn't ignore the pattern, and so I found myself staying in a small, damp rental cottage at the edge of town. An area bordered by dense woods that felt like they might swallow you whole if you wandered too far. The townsfolk were friendly enough, though distant. Conversations remained polite, limited to nods and pleasantries exchanged at the grocery store. Yet, beneath their surface-level warmth, I detected unease, a kind of collective anxiety hanging over the town like fog. There was something they weren't saying, something that connected them all, though they wouldn't admit it. I first heard about the deaths at the cafe. It had started with a single, hushed conversation at a table nearby. An older couple, their voices low, whispered about the recent funeral of Mr. Caldwell. He had been an old farmer who had met his end in a grisly tractor accident. But the way they spoke, it was as if the accident wasn't the real cause of death. "Did they see the cat?" the woman asked, her words cutting through the clatter of coffee mugs. "The night before," the man replied, "black, like the others." That was the moment I started paying attention. The black cat. A recurring visitor, always seen before tragedy struck. As a journalist, I was trained to dismiss such things, but something gnawed at the back of my mind, a feeling I couldn't quite place, like a door left ajar in a dark hallway. It was late the following evening when I first saw the cat. The air outside my cottage was thick with humidity, and the trees stood still, almost as if the world itself had paused for a moment. I had spent most of the day collecting vague anecdotes from townsfolk, all of them evasive when pressed for details. Still, each story circled back to the cat. Sightings followed by accidents, sudden illnesses, or violent deaths. I stepped outside for some fresh air, taking in the oppressive quiet. The only sound was the occasional chirp of crickets hidden in the tall grass. And then, just past the hedgerow that separated my cottage from the woods, I saw it. A small, sleek figure, crouched low in the shadows. The black cat. It stared at me with large, unblinking eyes, and for a brief second, I felt a strange pull. It was as if the creature was sizing me up, waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat, but I quickly shook off the feeling. A cat couldn't be responsible for deaths. It was just an animal, nothing more. But still, as I turned to go back inside, a chill ran down my spine. The next morning, I woke to news of another death. Martha Green, a local woman in her 60s, had fallen down the stairs of her home in the early hours. A freak accident, they called it. But I couldn't shake the fact that she had been one of the people I interviewed the day before. She had mentioned the cat in passing, saying she had seen it outside her window the night her husband died. Coincidence, I told myself. Just coincidence. But I couldn't believe that anymore. I returned to the cafe later that afternoon, where I overheard more whispers about Martha's death. She saw it, someone murmured. Same as Caldwell, same as the rest. It's the cat. I tried to remain objective, but something inside me had shifted. The pattern was undeniable. I had seen the cat. Could that mean I was next? I spent the next few days unraveling the threads of this mystery, each new discovery pulling me deeper into something that felt far darker than I had anticipated. Briar Hollow was no stranger to death, but this was different. There was fear in the air, a palpable tension that was slowly taking its toll on me. I found myself at the town's archives, poring over old newspaper clippings and obituaries. The pattern was clear. Every few years, a cluster of mysterious deaths, each preceded by a sighting of the same black cat. No one talked about it openly, but the evidence was there. buried in the gaps between the lines of local history. Then, one evening, I received a knock on my door. It was late, nearly midnight. I hesitated before answering, a sense of dread creeping in. When I opened the door, I found an old man standing on my porch. His name was John, one of the few who had spoken about the cat. "You need to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted nervously over his shoulder, as if he expected something to emerge from the shadows. "The cat. It marks you." I stared at him, confusion and fear swelling inside me. "Marks me? For what?" "For death," he replied. "It's not just a cat. It's something worse. You've seen it, haven't you?" I nodded slowly, fear gripping me. He grabbed my arm, his grip stronger than I expected. "You need to leave. Now, before it's too late." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I was too deep in this now, and I needed answers. John was my last lead. "What is it?" I demanded. "What's the connection? What's really going on here?" John hesitated, then sighed. "There's a legend in this town. A long time ago, a woman, Agnes Whitaker, was accused of witchcraft. She lived alone, kept to herself, and they said she had a black cat. When they came for her, they found the cat, but not her. Some say she cursed the town before disappearing, and that the cat carries out her revenge." I stared at him in disbelief. Witchcraft, a curse. It was too much, too absurd. But then, what else explained the deaths, the pattern? I couldn't ignore it anymore. Before I could press him further, a movement behind him caught my eye. There, just beyond the porch light, crouched the cat. It stared up at us, its black fur blending into the night, those cold, unblinking eyes fixed on me. John gasped, stepping back. "It's too late," he muttered. "It's already chosen." The cat's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I felt a deep, unshakable certainty that John was right. I had been marked. I couldn't sleep that night. The cat's eyes haunted me, every shadow in the cottage morphing into its lithe shape. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving far away, but something told me it wouldn't matter. The cat would find me. It always did. The next morning, I drove to the edge of town, back to the house where Agnes Whitaker had once lived. The place was nothing but ruins now, overgrown with ivy and tangled in brush. I had no plan, no idea what I was even looking for, but I felt compelled to be there, to face whatever was coming. As I walked through the overgrown yard, I saw the cat again, sitting among the ruins. It watched me, unblinking, but this time, something was different. The air felt still, too still. A realization began to form in my mind, something that had been eluding me all this time. It wasn't the cat. The deaths had nothing to do with it. The cat was a distraction, a symbol that the townspeople had clung to because they couldn't face the real truth. The accidents, the illnesses, they were random, just tragic events strung together by human fear and superstition. But the cat, it had become the scapegoat. As this truth settled over me, the tension I'd been carrying for weeks started to dissipate. The cat stood and padded silently away into the woods, as if its role here was done. I watched it go, feeling a strange sense of release. I left Briar Hollow the next day. No one else died while I was there, and no one stopped me from leaving. The cat, after all, was just a cat. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, did the fear itself give the cat its power, or had I simply survived because I stopped believing in it? Either way, the story was over. The drive out of Briar Hollow felt like leaving a dream. The narrow roads that had once twisted like labyrinthine paths of confusion and fear were now just ordinary streets, lined with aging trees and weathered houses. The tension that had gripped me during my time there slowly loosened its hold, replaced by a cautious relief. I turned my rearview mirror to catch a last glimpse of the town. And for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of black dart between the trees, but I didn't stop. I'd seen enough. The rational part of me had one, but the deeper, more instinctual part whispered that something darker lingered behind me. Something not fully understood. For weeks afterward, I tried to put Briar Hollow behind me. I wrote an article, careful to keep it grounded in the facts, though I knew the real story would never reach the page. I left out the legend of Agnes Whitaker and the tales of the Black Cat. I framed the deaths as coincidences, tragic events tied together only by the small-town folklore that had blown them out of proportion. That was the angle, and my editor ate it up. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unresolved, even in the safety of my apartment back in the city, where the noise of traffic and constant hum of life surrounded me. I would catch myself thinking about it, and the cat. Days passed, then weeks. I threw myself back into work, trying to lose myself in the mundanity of everyday life. And yet, there were moments, late at night, as I lay awake, that I could almost hear it. The soft padding of paws against a wooden floor, the faintest meow carried by a breeze. My rational mind dismissed it as residual paranoia, but I was no longer sure. It wasn't until I received an unexpected phone call that the uneasy calm I had built around myself began to crack. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was John, the old man from Briar Hollow, the same man who had warned me to leave. His voice sounded strained, almost frantic. "You need to come back," he said, without preamble. "John, what's going on?" "It's happening again," he whispered. "Another death. A young woman this time. She saw it. She saw the cat." My chest tightened, and for a moment, I said nothing. The logical part of me screamed that it was impossible. I had left the town behind, had closed the book on the story, but deep down, I had known this wasn't over. "I can't," I finally said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "John, the cat is just, you know what it is?" He cut me off. "You saw it, just like the rest of us. You might have escaped, but it's still there, still marking people." I felt my throat tighten. The rational explanation I had clung to now seemed paper-thin. "Come back," John pleaded. "You need to see for yourself." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in my hand, the familiar weight of dread creeping back into my chest. I had told myself that Briar Hollow was nothing more than a collection of tragic coincidences. I had told myself the cat was just a manifestation of local superstition, but John's voice had cracked open the possibility that I had been wrong. I wasn't ready to admit that just yet. Against my better judgment, I drove back, as the landscape outside my window began to shift from the city to the desolate roads leading to Briar Hollow. The same unsettling quiet returned. It was as though the town had been waiting for me, pulling me back into its grasp. The trees stood taller, darker, as if they were watching me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the familiar, winding streets. Everything looked the same, and yet there was something different, an undercurrent of tension. It wasn't just fear of the cat. It was something more primal, something that had sunk its claws into the town itself. John met me at the diner, his face etched with worry. He didn't waste any time on pleasantries. "She saw it the night before," he said. "Just like the others. This time, there's no denying it." We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. My carefully constructed rationality began to fray. What if John was right? What if the cat wasn't just a symbol of superstition, but something more? A force that had latched onto Briar Hollow, claiming lives, one by one. "There has to be something we're missing," I said, more to myself than to John. "Some logical explanation." He looked at me, his eyes tired, hollow. "You still don't get it, do you?" I frowned. "Get what?" "It's not the cat that's killing people. It never was." The weight of his words hung in the air between us. I stared at him, my mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle that had haunted me for so long. If it wasn't the cat, what was it? The cat only marks them, John said, leaning closer. But it's us. It's the town. We've been feeding into this for years, letting the fear grow. It's not just superstition. It's the fear itself. I felt a cold chill wash over me. Could it really be that simple? Could the townspeople's collective belief in the curse have given it life? Had we all been so fixated on the cat that we had missed the true source of the horror, ourselves? That night, I returned to my cottage. I had no answers, only a growing sense of dread that gnawed at me. John's words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't fully accept them. It was too easy, too convenient. Fear couldn't kill people. Superstition couldn't claim lives. I sat by the window, staring out at the woods, waiting. For what? I wasn't sure, but I knew something was coming. The hours dragged on, the house growing colder as the night deepened. And then, just as I had expected, I saw it. The cat. It was standing at the edge of the woods, its black fur almost blending into the darkness. Its eyes, those piercing, unblinking eyes, were fixed on me, as if it had been waiting for this moment. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't look away. I stood and made my way outside, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The cat didn't move. It just watched, waiting for me to come closer. As I approached, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't afraid anymore. John had been right. The cat wasn't the killer. It was the catalyst. The town's fear, the whispered legends, the belief in the curse, they had all given it power. But now, standing in front of it, I understood the truth. "You don't have any power over me," I whispered, more to myself than to the creature. The cat blinked slowly, and in that moment, I knew it was over. I left Briar Hollow the next morning, not bothering to say goodbye. The town would continue to exist, steeped in its fear, bound by its belief in the curse of the black cat. But I was free now. I had faced the thing that had haunted me, and I had seen it for what it truly was, a reflection of the fear we carry inside ourselves. I never returned to Briar Hollow. In time, the memories of that strange, unsettling place began to fade. But every now and then, late at night, I would think of the cat. I would wonder how many more lives it had marked, how many more deaths would follow. And then I would remind myself that the cat wasn't real. It was never the cat. But even now, as I sit here, writing this, I can't help but glance at the window, just to be sure.